Open proceedings and declare open this third hearing of the Joint Select Committee on Parliamentary Standards. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. My name is Sharon Clayton and I'm the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by video conference by Senator Mehreen Faruqi, as well as Ms Joanne Ryan, and I hope to be shortly joined by Ms Nola Marino as well. So please don't be disturbed if another Member of Parliament appears. We are expecting Ms Marino to join us. The committee will be conducting today's hearing via video conference and in person here in Canberra. These are public proceedings and are being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, you are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by either House as a contempt. It is also contempt to give false or misleading evidence. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground on which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that an answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, also be made at any other time. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying that the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. The committee, just for everyone's information, is due to report by the 1st of December 2022, where a witness takes a question on notice at this hearing today. An answer should be provided to the Secretariat by the 10th of October. I'll remind committee members and witnesses who are appearing via video conference today that when you are not speaking, please mute your microphones. Now, thank you. That takes us to our first witnesses today, and I would like to now welcome via video conference representatives of the Australian Dispute Resolution Advisory Council. I understand we have the chair, Ms Ruth McColl, and we have Dr Alison Boyle and Dr Kate Chetty. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been provided to you. I'm just checking that's the case. Excellent, thank you. And for the Hansard record, I'll get you to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today, and then I'll come back inviting you to make any introductory remarks. So I'm not sure who would like to go first. Perhaps Ms Ruth McColl, you're the chair. You might just introduce yourself and the capacity in which you're appearing today.
Yes, my name is Ruth McColl. I appear as the chair of the Australian Dispute Resolution Advisory Council.
Thank you.
I'm Alison Boyle. I'm a member of the same organisation, also known as ADRAC, its acronym, and I appear as a member of that body.
Thank you.
And Kate Chetty, and I'm also a member of ADRAC, appearing in that capacity.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of that, of any remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions. Do you have a preference of the order? Who's delivering the opening statement?
I'm delivering it, Ms Clayton,
Great.
the chair.
Thank you. Over to you, Ms McCoy.
Thank you. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I am located, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also the traditional owners of the land where my colleagues are located during this hearing, and thank them for their custodianship of country. The Australian Dispute Resolution Advisory Council, or ADRAC as you have heard, is voluntary, unaligned independent council of 12 individuals who are thought leaders in dispute resolution theory and practices. I am the chair and I am joined by two council members, Dr. Alison Boyle and Dr. Kate Chetty. ADRAC's interests lie in exploring, researching and promoting better dispute resolution in all areas of Australian life. This includes in a workplace context, as is relevant here today. ADRAC's expertise does not concern the creation of codes of conduct, but the mechanisms for their enforcement. In particular, the various dispute resolutions, approaches and processes that contribute to effective complaints handling. Thus, ADRAC's submissions to this committee focused on the terms of reference relating to the enforcement of a code. We recommended that there be systematic approaches to supporting and enforcing a code, as well as to designing approaches for handling workplace complaints. ADRAC commends the work completed by the committee so far, including the exploration of a code of conduct. This is an important step forward and will send a critical message about acceptable workplace behaviour, in particular for high-paced, stressful workplaces such as those encompassed in the Commonwealth Parliamentary workplaces, which I'll reduce to its acronym of CPW. The work being proposed will set the scene for a more positive workplace culture. That said, while a code of conduct and its accompanying investigative and enforcement mechanisms is important, such a code should be treated as one element of our holistic dispute management system that is focused as much on prevention and early intervention as on enforcement. We encourage the CPW to take a methodical and inclusive approach to designing and implementing a broader dispute management system. It should start with broad-scale education and training to help reinforce a positive workplace culture. It should also be responsive in all circumstances, including as an early intervention where a workplace or team starts showing signs of dysfunction, right through to alleged breaches of the code and other serious incidents. The dispute system design approach referred to in ADRAC's submissions treats stakeholder consultation as one of the most important steps in designing, reviewing and implementing the system. What do staff think is required? What would best help to build a positive workplace culture? What will give confidence to staff that their grievances will be managed appropriately and fairly? What will help parliamentary members commit to the system? In terms of actual dispute resolution processes, we draw the committee's attention to restorative practices. Many of the more mainstream and better known dispute resolution processes, such as mediation and conciliation, will be useful in some circumstances. ADRAC has recently published a report on conciliation in particular, entitled Conciliation Connecting the Dots, which is available on our website. We found conciliation as a process to be an effective and equitable means of resolution. But in complex workplaces, such as the CPW, where there can be significant power imbalances between parties, more contemporary approaches which are based on restorative practices may be more effective. Restorative practices can involve facilitated conferences with the individual involved as well as other affected people. These processes are designed to acknowledge the disruption caused by the dispute, to restore the complainant, respondent and the community through healing and problem solving. It is about creating a non-adversarial dialogue to help foster accountability, forgiveness and community reintegration. If it would be helpful to the committee, we would be happy to talk further about the system design process, restorative practices and other dispute resolution processes or any other dispute resolution issues and how they may apply in the CPW context. ADRAC's website contains a number of resources relevant to the committee's inquiry, including materials prepared by our predecessor body, the National Alternative Dispute Resolution Advisory Council. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms McColl. I'll go to questions from committee members now, and I'll go first to Senator Marine Faruqi, and then I'll check in if Ms Ryan or Ms Marino have any questions, if they just let me know. Over to you, Senator Faruqi.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
And thank you so much for coming here to provide us evidence. Your submission states that the enforcement system that this committee develops or Parliament develops should be able to intervene where toxic workplace culture extends beyond individual behavior and requires broader intervention. So I just want to ask you, what should that intervention involve, and what sanctions should be available to address a toxic workplace?
So I just missed the end of that
Yeah.
question, Senator.
So what should that intervention that you're proposing involve, and that what sort of sanctions should be available to address like a toxic workplace culture rather than, addressing one offending individual?
Is well, the start of the process, and I'll invite either of my colleagues to contribute also to this answer, Senator, but the start place of our the way we look at the enforcement side of it, and it is a systemic and a holistic approach, and that could encompass obviously where there are multiple participants in a dispute. And one illustration might be, and here we are, I am in particular talking about in a workplace where you've got staffers and a member of parliament, and maybe there was within the workplace that sort of dysfunction to which I referred in the opening statement, and then one would could have whoever might be a third party come in and seek to understand the dispute and seek to offer one of the multiple systems of dispute resolution which might be seen as most appropriate to that particular circumstance. And in particular, in a small environment, if it turns toxic, obviously that can just lead to the breakdown of the workplace almost entirely. And one would have to try and, as we've said, intervene very early and as soon as possible to try and address that.
And do you think sanctions are an important part of intervention?
I think sanctions have their appropriate place, but sanctions can sometimes be almost a deal breaker, if I can put it that way. I would favour the idea that sanctions could come at the end of the process, and if one could use one of those forms of dispute resolution, which is a more non-adversarial one, to which again I referred in the opening, that would be a better approach in a very small workplace, such as that which I referred to at the outset.
And do you have a view on training? Because really where we want to get to is that this sort of behavior doesn't happen, or trying to avoid it as much as possible. So what role does training play in this? And I'm talking about various types of training. Of course, there's ethical behavior training, anti-racism training, disability discrimination training. Do you think this sort of training plays a role in trying to prevent behavior that we are talking about today?
Training is vital. If people don't understand the basis from which, for example, which would be the basis of the code which you're charged to devise, and then also the enforcement mechanisms and ultimately any sanctions. If people don't understand the values which underpin all of this, then it will be very difficult to persuade them actually to understand what's now happening in what is the, as Commissioner Jenkins described at the outset of her report, is setting the standard and changing a culture, which I think it is recognised, as not least by the establishment of this committee, does need some work. And I could invite either of my colleagues to, they might also wish to contribute to the questions you've asked so far.
I might just add there, Senator, that one of the reasons why we have suggested that a dispute systems design process is taken is because it can include all of those elements. So initially from that training and education process through to intervention options, right through to potential responses, which, as our chair has referred to, may very well include sanctions, but other more sort of contemporary dispute resolution mechanisms like the restorative engagement, restorative practices might also be particularly relevant in this type of workplace.
And I guess going back to your submission, it also noted that the complaints management system relating to the code of conduct should not become a means of addressing only the most serious grievances. So how can we actually ensure that the codes themselves, encourage workers at every level to report inappropriate behavior?
Well, as I said at the outset, we're not really a body which addresses devising codes, but I'm sure Commissioner Jenkins has already addressed you, as I saw on your website, in relation to that. But I think if we go back to the educative issue that you raised a moment ago in your question, you really need to make sure that all people involved in the workplace understand that they can initiate and bring up an issue and see at what level it might fit into the overall system. Some issues may seem to be too small, but, for example, looked at in the context you referred to earlier, that sort of toxic workplace culture, you can see how it could contribute and could be almost, the seed from which such a culture could germinate if you don't nip it in the bud, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. In your submission as well, you do talk about dispute resolution principles, and I think you mentioned them in your opening statement as well. And those dispute resolution principles should underpin the complaints management system for the code. And I guess these principles, as I look at them, they focus on both parties coming to the table and being committed to resolving the dispute. But I guess there are cases, like some egregious cases, maybe, racial discrimination, for instance, where a mediated approach could be pretty traumatic for the complainant, and where, wrongdoing might be clear. So I guess how can we, in these cases, make sure that the complainant in these processes is not subjected to further trauma, harm, and discrimination?
Look, I might ask Dr. Boyle or Dr. Chetty if they wish to deal with that at this stage, Senator.
Sure.
I think the key here is going to be flexibility, because not all incidents are going to be the same and not all complainants and respondents are going to be the same. There are certain dispute resolution mechanisms that do allow for or do provide for those sorts of special circumstances. And we see examples like a restorative engagement process, for example. And so those don't necessarily involve a respondent participating in a sort of facilitated conference process. That might be another senior representative of the organisation that takes part on behalf of the workplace in an attempt to not only resolve the issue, but it is about reintegrating the person back into the workplace community and ensuring forward. One of the keys with this, the entire process will be making sure that people feel supported, that if they do come forward with a complaint, they will be taken seriously. They have confidence in the system that the right approach will be taken according to the circumstances. So it really is about flexibility and making that support available at every stage of the process.
Because we did see from the Jenkins review that it is much harder for marginalized groups to even raise a complaint. We heard from people of color and First Nations people that then when they raise complaints of intersectional nature, which includes racism and sexism, that they were often met by aggressive responses. So I guess your expertise is in dispute resolution, but I want to ask for
This is the last
people
question,
like
Senator Faruqi. Last question while I go to Ms. Marino after this one.
Sure. For groups or people like that, what kind of flexibility is to make sure that these processes are fit for purpose? You said restorative processes. Could you give us a quick example of what it might look like for a person from a marginalized group and how that support is provided through that process?
Could I just, Senator, by taking the methodical approach that is through designing the system to suit this quite large and complex set of workplaces, you are ensuring that everyone in the workplace at that time is involved in helping to put it together. So you don't actually have someone sitting somewhere else altogether coming up with a set of processes that suits this workplace or this cluster of workplaces. You actually sit down with all the people in there. You consult with all of them how they would like to see this work, and with the range of processes that are available and the capacity to customise them to suit which ones they would like to see included in it. And one of the key factors in that consultation process is that the people who in the past have been marginalised are actually included in it. Part of the purpose of the consultation process is to help people shift away from the history of their toxic workplaces, in plural. That's part of what you're doing with the consultation. You're stepping away from what used to happen into the preferred behaviour for the future, and the rest of designing the process builds on that, including the sorts of processes that people think they will be wanting to work with. And you set it up to suit them. And that gives it the best chance of success and the best chance of inclusion.
Thanks very much.
I'm doing a range of work with First Nations people at the moment in this area, and I am quite aware of how enormous the obstacles are to get past in order to have a properly inclusive process happening.
Thank you. That's really good advice. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ms Marino.
Oh, thank you. And look, thank you very much for your time in putting together your submission for the committee and your time with us today. You've mentioned that your role is not to advise us on the code, but you've got that wonderful focus on the dispute resolution process. And I think you acknowledged earlier on, Ms McCall, about the individual nature. It's not unusual, but some of the challenges that face a stressful, high-pressured world that we live in, and live and work in, and as do our teams of people. So I'm really interested. Ms Boyle spoke about working with employees as well, but from my experience, the simpler and easier the process is for people to understand and have confidence in, one, the more likely they are to engage, and two, the more likely we are to get a fair and appropriate outcome. So I'd be really interested, without being prescriptive essentially, and it may be a big question and hard to answer, but if you've got anything to offer us beyond this hearing about a potential but appropriate process that takes employer, employee, whoever it is, from a series of steps that are clear, defined, that are a starting point, even for the conversation, Ms Boyle, that you spoke about with your employees, giving your experience as a group that focuses on this dispute resolution, I'd be really interested in you offering us something that is at least a starting point, even though it's not part of the code essentially, but that we have appropriate, easily understood, simple, clear processes for people at least to start the conversation.
Well, my understanding is it would have to be part of the code in any event, assuming you accept the Jenkins recommendations, which include, for example, establishing this, these two offices, the OPSC and the IPSC, one of which will be involved with the, in effect, enforcement of the code. I mean, for my part, I would think it's very important, even understanding your very real sound proposition that it should be as simple and offer a simple starting point. Nevertheless, that it be in a framework that everybody is applying and everybody is working within. I mean, I'm not sure if you're asking, there are a lot of names of dispute resolution processes. You've already heard us talk about at least three of them: mediation, conciliation and restorative justice so far this afternoon. We haven't really delved into any of them. I'm not suggesting we do. But I think one approach would be to recognise that if you go back to the question about education, which the Senator Faruqi raised, if you educate people, then what might at the outset appear complex is in fact, once they understand it, it isn't. I'm not sure if that's where you're really coming from, but...
Yeah, look, I want to make it easy for people who have an issue to deal with it. I mean,
Yes.
that is what we're trying to do here, is how do we simplify the process and have it in such a way that people are comfortable to use it, are confident in it, and that all parties involved are really clear. Now, I know we talked earlier, or you talked earlier about tailoring it to suit that particular workplace or environment, and I think I understand that well, but within a framework of what's available. And so it's, I want to, generally, I find if people are really clear, the education and training I understand, if we get that bit right, that helps. That's the first thing. Then secondly, here are the steps that you can follow to get you to where you want to be, whichever process you take. I just think the simpler and more clearly defined, these are options for you. These are the things you can do, so that people can see, well, there's a pathway for me to follow. I'm confident in it. It is going to get me to deal with the issues that are concerning me or concerning this workplace, and I'm confident that we're going to get to the right space. You know, that's really what I'm interested in, as trying to define this, not in a way that's inflexible, but in a way that keeps it clear and concise, and there's a consistency across it, so people know what they need to do and how to do it.
Well, as I said in my opening, and as we've said in a more expanded form in our submissions, the dispute system design approach we're recommending treats stakeholder consultation as one of the most important elements. So I think the answer to your question is possibly more easily going to be found when you actually go to the stakeholders, namely those involved, the staffers, yourselves. You're obviously already in the system, but engaging with those people and trying to devise that process that you're looking for with their assistance.
Yeah, look, I think one of the great challenges will be to come to a concise agreement in that space, because in our workplaces we have a great diversity of people from a range of backgrounds, you know, so coming to and it may be easier than we think to get to that point where they're confident in the process. But I think, you know, I'd be really wanting something that's clear for both employer, employee. This is where we start. This is where we're planning to get to. These are the options we've got available to us, and clear in your mind, this is what you do. And hopefully, you know, that then encourages people to follow the process because they're confident in it.
Could I just, sorry, Kate, go on.
Sorry, Alison. I was just going to say that we talk a lot about flexibility. So, you know, it is a bit of a choose your own adventure, if you excuse the description, according to the incident, the complainant, the respondent. Yeah. So in many ways, you know, a simple 1, 2, 3 you know, is not what we would suggest with a complex workplace like this one. That said, there is going to be a level of commonality. So there has to be a mechanism for individuals to raise or report an incident. At that level, there might be an assessment as to whether or not it needs to go to further fact-finding or an investigation for a potential breach. Beyond that, you might be considering things like restorative processes or sanctions and that type of thing. Throughout the whole process, there's a need for dispute resolution mechanisms to be available. But we'll certain organisations that even you know, the process is too complex for individuals, and particularly an individual that might be, you know, suffering from obviously a high level of stress because of what's happening to them. It's not always necessary for them to know what the steps of the process are. And that's where the role of champions, or we see some organisations have things like equity advisors and that type of thing, which is basically a phone a friend, where those people can put their hand up and say, look, this is happening to me, it's not right, can someone help me? And then that person, you know, can act. And I think the Jenkins report referred to champions and trusted individuals within the organisation that have already taken on that type of role. And so this is something that can potentially be formalised. So that is the person with the knowledge of the system who can help guide the individual through.
Okay, look, Chair, thank you. You've given me
Thanks.
plenty of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask three questions. Oh, sorry, Ms Boyle, if you can make this very succinct, go ahead.
I will. There's three dimensions to your question. One is the range of processes that are available. Do they include simple processes? If they don't, your system won't work. They must include simple, straightforward processes, but they are customisable to suit. The second dimension is how referrals happen in the first place. There needs to be a single point of referral, and whoever is running the single point of referral needs to know the system back to front and what processes are sitting in it. The third dimension is for organisations that take this on for the first time, the first few matters they have to deal with will inevitably be showcase matters, because everyone will be watching. That is where your confidence and trust is created, in those showcase matters. They have to be done immaculately. The outcomes have to be almost, you have to make sure you take on matters that are almost guaranteed to produce a successful outcome, because the whole place is going to be watching them, whether they're confidential or not. So it's those three different things are going to create the confidence and trust that you're talking about, and that's based on experience. Those are the three things that matter. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to try, because we're supposed to wind up in 1 minute, so let's see how we go. I wanted to firstly ask whether you think education should be compulsory, the education and training components that we spoke about, whether that's compulsory for parliamentarians and or their staff. That's question one.
Succinct, yes. Is yes succinct enough?
Yes is great. Assuming that's a universal opinion, is it?
I think so.
If you don't have the parliamentarians involved in all the activities, you will, in some way, you will not get their commitment to the system. It's really straightforward. Thank you.
The next part of your submission, I just wanted to explore. Some of my questions have been answered, so that's great. But how about your submission calls for an initial dispute resolution action to be taken before you get to that formal investigation process. This was on page 6 of your submission. I'm just wondering if you think that the proposed new structure of this Office of Parliamentary Standards Commission, the OPSC, which Jenkins refers to or proposes, would be a better first step for complaints before taking issues through to the proposed IPSC, so the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission. In serious complaints, that's where those serious complaints that need formal investigation go. So my question really is, do you think that there's, given your preference for a scalable sort of approach to dispute resolution, if you would agree that you begin with taking issues to the OPSC first?
I think with the history of this particular cluster of workplaces, and the history, as far as I know as a member of the public, isn't particularly good, I would actually be looking at making everything go through an independent point from the word go.
Okay.
I think independence is highly likely to be very important to get people on board with this system right from the word go. as the system goes through and gets evaluated and settles in and all that, then parts of it may be able to come back into the less independent area, the internal area. But I would be focusing on independent to try and get this fixed as quickly as possible. It's a cultural thing.
The next question I just have to end on then is that your submission notes a pilot period for the codes and enforcement, followed by a review, again on page 6 of your submission. Do you think that after this is completed, there's a need for ongoing reviews? What would the timeframes look like in your view?
Yes, again, I think
always be ongoing
consensus is yes.
Sorry, one at a time.
Sorry.
I'll go to Ms McCoyle first and then I'll come back to Ms Boyle.
Again, the answer is yes. I think all of these systems need constant review to make sure they're consistent with contemporary standards. You build on experience. As Dr Boyle has said, you try and make the startup matters dealt with in an exemplary fashion, but you just make sure that that continues and that people are refreshed and reminded, if necessary, about what the code is trying to achieve and how the enforcement process works.
Thanks. And Dr Boyle, sorry.
No, right, that's absolutely. If the people who are involved in the workplace know it's going to be constantly evaluated, they will be more confident in it.
Do you have a time frame that constant evaluation takes place in?
Not really, no.
No. Okay, that's fine.
That's something that gets sorted out along the way.
Well, thank you very much for your patience to go. We started a little bit late and we've run a bit over time, so my profuse apologies. I will try and get us back on track, however. But thank you very much for your evidence today. And if you have taken any questions on notice, as I said at the beginning, the request would be to provide responses to the Secretariat by the 10th of October. And on that note, this committee will now adjourn until 2:30 p.m. Thanks again very much for your time. Very much appreciate it today.
Thank you again for inviting us to attend.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Time being 2:30, we will reconvene, and I am delighted to welcome representatives of Fair Agenda today. We've got with us the Executive Director, Ms Renee Carr, and the Campaign Manager, Ms Elisa Shaw. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been given to you both. Excellent. And for the Hansard record, I'll ask you to please state your name and capacity, your full name and capacity in which you appear today. Then I'll come back and invite you to make an opening statement and people, committee members will ask questions there. So I'll just get it first for you to both state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today.
Yep. Renee Carr, appearing as Executive Director of Fair Agenda.
Thank you.
Elisa Shaw, Campaign Manager, Fair Agenda.
Great. And I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, as I said, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions. So who would like to lead off?
I will.
Thanks, Ms Carr. Over to you.
Fair Agenda is a national independent community campaigning organisation working for gender equity. We have over 43,000 members across the country, and we are working jointly for a future where we can all have safety, security and agency over our lives and bodies, no matter our gender. Fair Agenda members are engaged on a range of gender equity issues, and in recent years we have helped to decriminalise abortion in Queensland, New South Wales and South Australia, push residential halls to improve their training to prevent sexual violence, and advocated for state and federal reforms to improve the prevention and response to gender-based violence. Our members have expressed significant dismay and distress at the crisis of gender-based violence across our communities and have campaigned extensively for improvements to prevention and response to gender-based violence across a range of settings. Evidence shows that to prevent gender-based violence at a societal level, we must address gender inequality, including attitudes and disrespect and power imbalances. We welcome the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's recommendation that Parliament should approach this reform process with an expectation that Federal Parliament set the standard for workplace culture. In preparing our submission to this committee, we asked our members a series of questions, including why they considered integrity in Parliament important and what values they would like our elected leaders to exhibit. We had nearly 200 responses, with members collectively contributing over 36 hours of time to answer those questions, and have reflected the responses in our submission. One quote from members which we feel captures a lot of the sentiment expressed is, "A person who acts with integrity is trustworthy. We must be able to trust our MPs to work for the national best interest and to represent Australia to the rest of the world."
Fair Agenda's submission has been drafted with a focus on a code of conduct for parliamentarians, but we do note and support that there should be codes for all three sort of areas that's outlined in the Set the Standard report. In approaching our submission and contributing to this discussion for the committee, we've tried to think through a strengths-based frame of what Parliament that upholds Australian values would look like and what public expectations would look like. Fundamentally to this is a code that articulates strong values as a basis to ground and guide behaviours and attitudes. Creating cultural change is very challenging, but we believe enunciating clear and consistent values that everyone understands and upholds will support this process. In the interest of time and brevity, I'll just highlight a couple of the things that we've included in our opening statement to the committee. In terms of the content of the code, we recommend that there's general principles of good conduct and character that apply to all parliamentarians. This should articulate values, and we've included values that our members spoke to us about that were most important to them. These include respect, inclusion, and honesty. The other things we'd like to highlight in terms of how a code is applied in practice is that the code needs to apply to both professional and personal conduct, and that we'd ask the committee to consider that personal conduct relevant to members' parliamentary duties and responsibilities is something that's particularly highlighted and considered in drafting the code. We've also provided in our submission what we call a bit of a test or a thought experiment, which we feel reflects our members' expectations and the expectations of the public more broadly in terms of the efficacy of a code. So as Renee spoke to, our members were quite activated and concerned last year around the inadequacy of a process to deal with allegations around the then Attorney General, Christian Porter. We want to ensure clear, consistent and an independent process for review when allegations arise in Parliament. In addition to our submission, we have spoken to and read a number of the other organisational submissions and reviewed previous sessions of the public hearings of this committee, and we feel there's some additional comments that might help the committee with its deliberations. The first of these is the role and the function of the IPSC, so its interaction with other rules, bodies, support services, and drawing a distinction as to when matters are referred to this body. We reiterate that the IPSC should sit as a puzzle piece alongside other rules such as standing orders, and expect that to an extent the enforcement of the code is done in a more decentralised way to leaders within the parliamentary space, such as the President of the Senate or the Speaker of the House. Notwithstanding this, we believe that there should be scope for actions and behaviours that are considered a breach of the code to be referred to the IPSC, particularly if they are egregious, consistent or particularly targeted in nature. We also believe that the IPSC is going to interact with the Parliamentary Workplace Support Service, which was a recommendation in the Set the Standard report, and believe that the complaints that have brought to the PWSS so far have had quite a high success rate in terms of resolution, noting there's informal and formal reporting processes. It's going to be really important to tease out the interaction of these bodies to ensure that there's a trauma-informed best practice solution to supporting people, particularly people who are survivors of sexual assault, but we could also extend this to bullying, harassment and other things that could be traumatising. Regarding sanctions, Fair Agenda supports a breadth of sanctions, and it's important that there is a breadth in order to have a proportionate sanction for the issue. We would again like to reiterate that the role of parliamentarians is extremely important in considering what sanctions should apply. At this stage, we don't expect sanctions would include any expelling of parliamentarians from the Parliament. There's other organisations that have made submissions, but this is not our view at the moment. Regarding how the code should be implemented, we do believe strongly that the code should be legislated for by Parliament, not administered through standing orders, and that's something we'd be very happy to talk about further. But we believe fundamentally this is due to needing to ensure consistency and clarity across both chambers, given that standing orders can change with a majority vote in each chamber, which mean we could easily get into the position where there's effectively different standards for different parliamentarians depending on what chamber of parliament that they're in. Lastly, we believe the code should have what is more of a high level of detail in it and then be supported by policies that underpin it. So this could include specific values in the code and specific behaviours that are prohibited, such as gender-based violence, other forms of disrespect and discrimination, and that the details and the definitions would sit below in the policy. This means that they don't run the risk of being, made out of date. They can be adapted with time far more easily than a legislated code could. I think that's all our comments at this point, Chair.
Thank you. I appreciate that summary, and I understand you have an opening statement with a bit more detail that you'd like to table, so we'll include that as well. Thank you. I'll go first to Senator Faruqi and then to other members who have some questions. Over to you first, Senator Faruqi.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, both. And thank you so much for coming in and also providing fantastic submission. Your submission has raised what I think are very important issues of intersectionality, and specifically prohibiting conduct that is racist, homophobic, transphobic, and ableist. And Ms. Shaw, I noticed that in the Canberra Times, you told them that a new code of conduct should address alleged racial abuse, as well as other forms of discrimination. So do you mind just explaining to the committee a little bit why it's so important to be clear and prescriptive in identifying these types of behavior in the code, so we ensure that these harms don't remain unnamed?
Absolutely. Thanks, Senator Faruqi, for the question. We believe that intersectionality is really core to having a proper and robust code that would reflect the expectations of the public. So intersectionality is fundamentally about understanding different aspects of a person's identity, how these intersect and interlock, and can mean that a person experiences unique discrimination and marginalisation. So this term is often known to be coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a professor at the Columbia Law School now. She also has a Juris Doctor from Harvard Law School. She coined this term in 1989, and it was originally used for her to, talk about the experience mainly of black women in America, and so how an employer might employ white women and black men. But of course, when you think about those things either side, one is around race and one is around gender, doesn't actually account for the experiences of black women and that intersecting identity. So given this, Crenshaw has used intersectionality in law, but also advocates more broadly that we should be looking at it and thinking about it as a tool to investigate and understand problems as well as apply solutions. And we think this is extremely relevant in the context of a code. I guess we've also outlined in our submission, and it's worth mentioning that arguably you can't actually address issues of gender-based violence and gender inequality without looking at intersectionality. Because there is simply a diversity of women, if you're just looking through a gender frame, that intersect with Parliament, whether they're visitors or parliamentarians such as yourself, Senator Faruqi. And so we do very much advocate that the committee should include in its code specific mention to issues of intersectionality, so such as racism, transphobia, homophobia, ableist, sort of slurs or comments. Again, we would say that this should be kept at a high level within the code, and then there can be supporting policies that underpin this and define this, and they can also be updated, given a lot of some of these issues, in particular around the queer community, are constantly evolving our understanding and what could be seen as respectful and inclusive. I hope that's an appropriate and a fulsome answer to your question, Senator.
Yeah, it is really great. Thank you. In your submission, you've also said that if parliamentarians are not held accountable for bad behaviour, it signals to the community that this behaviour is acceptable, and it could embolden perpetrators and discourage victims or targets. And I know you mentioned in your opening statement that you don't support expulsion of parliamentarians as a sanction. But what would be the toughest sanction that you propose to signal to the community that Parliament takes misconduct of the worst kind seriously?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yes, it is extremely important. Parliamentarians hold positions of public trust. And there's, I guess, an argument that parliamentarians with additional duties also hold arguably more powerful and have like a greater weight, I suppose, in the public eye, given their decision-making power. It is so important that role modelling of parliamentarians, it sets a tone for the community, which is why we did make comments about emboldening perpetration and discouraging survivors. So what happens in Parliament, has a ripple effect in our community in terms of how we think about issues, what we think is acceptable. In terms of the specific sanctions, the question on that, we agree with what Commissioner Jenkins put in the standard around a range of sanctions for breaches of the code. I don't think we have a strong opinion as to what would be the most extreme. We definitely are an advocate that sanctions should be proportionate. Again, when we think about proportionality, though, it needs to consider what the additional duties of a parliamentarian is, and also their professional and personal conduct. So certainly in the UK Parliament, there is I guess, a precedent that we could take on in Australia around personal conduct, and if that's bringing the Parliament into disrepute. In the UK, and I believe you're hearing from the UK Parliament later, so I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they also do have sanctions around expulsion. As we've said at this point, that's not our opinion. Partly because the advice we've had from other organisations that are far more expert in constitutional law, for instance, have told us that there could be issues around, the Constitution, and I guess just talking about democratically elected representatives. So again, that's why it's not our position, but we agree that there should be a breadth of sanctions that support proportionality.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I think we would like to see the IPSC having scope to consider the particular additional duties that somebody might hold and the relevance of the alleged breach, and if there is found to be a breach of the code, scope to consider and make recommendations about those additional duties, whether that be on a committee or a ministerial role relevant to the breach. So we would want to see that within scope for the Commissioner. The other thing that I think we would like to see concurrent to this process is for a breach of the code to be considered at the party level relevant to pre-selection and reselection, recognising that's probably outside of the scope of the committee in this instance. And finally, I think in terms of signalling to the public the importance and seriousness of these issues and that they are being treated seriously by the Parliament, we think it would be very important that the Independent Parliamentary Standard Commissioner could make public the findings and high-level sanctions that are recommended if there is found to be a breach, so that there is clarity for the public on what sanctions have been recommended, whether or not those are then implemented by the Parliament.
Thank you. And I think the recommendation that you made earlier is very valid for the task force who is looking at those issues. So if let's say in your organization, if an employee, and let's say that's a white employee, tells a colleague who is a person of color to piss off back to where they came from, and then goes on and offers to drive them to the airport, what would happen?
I was going to say, I don't know if you want to take this. I think, Senator, we're obviously aware of the context in which you're talking. I suppose we're not here to offer a judgment about what would happen. What we're here to advocate is that we have in place a robust code that can be investigated in order to make findings, to see if there are breaches of that code. So certainly in the case of comments which, from what you've just said, I personally would take that to be racist comments. If there was a comment that someone felt was racist, there is an opportunity to deal with that in the context of the Parliament, in the relevant chamber, or if it happens, say, in this committee by the chair. And we've said, I guess, this in our additional comments, if there's comments that are made that seem particularly egregious, are targeted or are consistent, so that, that's happened, there's sort of, I guess, a track of them over time, that could also be something, or we think it would be something that is valid to be referred to the IPSC for investigation. And then, of course, it's up to the IPSC and that body to investigate that allegation and make findings and deliver sanctions. So it's really about making sure we've got, I guess, the IPSC is supported to have the scope and have the remit to investigate a comment that could be racist and make findings to make sure that that person is appropriately sanctioned if a breach has been made.
I suppose to answer your question more directly regarding our organisation, I think we have very clear values internally as an organisation that exists to advocate for fairness and gender equity, and we would see that as a breach of those values and therefore a significant performance issue and organisational problem that would need action.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I was just wondering, do you think there is value in participants in the workplace that I am in to, to understand clearly what of discrimination
I'm sorry, Senator Faruqi, we're losing some of your audio there.
Sorry. I will start again. I was just asking if you think that there is value in participants going through training to understand what these different forms of discrimination actually mean, and that examples or guidance could be provided to MPs, and specifically, I think, probably to the leaders in the chambers, like the Senate President and House Speaker, but all MPs, for them to have a better understanding of what these various forms of discrimination are.
Absolutely. Yes, I think the short answer is yes. The code, and I think the UK Parliament submission also touched on this, it needs to be bolstered and reinforced by training. Commissioner Jenkinson set out an office for parliamentary, I think it was parliamentary culture. And I think that's essentially parliamentarian staffing and culture. That is a key part of all the recommendations. I think it's 11 through 19 around systems to support performance. So I suppose that, again, the code in itself is not enough. It needs to be fostered. What we're really aiming for here is cultural change. Cultural change is difficult. We know behaviours and attitudes are the hardest thing to change. And so it's about how do we make sure that is felt and that is taken up across the Parliament. That is why we are talking about our values being embedded in the code, and again, consistency of that code, which should be legislated for, in our opinion, to make sure people can really understand that respect and inclusion is paramount. But of course, in those recommendations 11 to 19, Commissioner Jenkins does talk a lot about the need for training, and it should not be a box-ticking exercise. We know from a gender-based violence perspective that, a one-off training in your induction is not going to cut it. We're not an expert at training provision, so we'd advise that. I'm sure there's other organisations or experts that you can go to, and I'm sure that as part of this process there would be independent experts that could support this, but certainly needs to be bolstered by a range of efforts.
And just going back to intersectionality, I mean, from where I sit, training on anti-racism, on disability discrimination, on First Nations cultural awareness should be part of that training package. And do you think it should be? And should these sorts of training packages and the other things that you've mentioned beyond induction, should they be mandatory?
Yes, I think our position would be yes. We don't have that in our submission, but again, drawing on, I suppose, our experience in universities that Renee might be able to speak to a bit more, and also, I suppose, what we do as an organisation and what we see works best in terms of best practice for promoting respect and inclusion. It's, I guess that fundamentally it's about empathy, isn't it? That supports respect and inclusion. And so any training that is going to support that, to sort of put yourself in somebody's shoes, to understand the nature of someone's lived experience as well as the systemic and structural issues that they will face every day. I suppose that goes back to Crenshaw and her findings within the law that there's such unique experiences that need to be unpacked to be properly understood. All those things will support a parliament that we believe should have values of respect and inclusion as fundamental to the business that's carried out in this place every day.
My understanding is that our watch, the national experts in primary prevention of gender-based violence, specifically name intersecting discriminations as components of the drivers of gender-based violence and the importance of addressing those within any prevention framework. And I'm happy to kind of take that on notice and find the relevant piece there if they're not appearing before you in their own right.
Yeah, that'd be
Thank
great.
you. Senator Faruqi, have you got
Yes.
Have you got more
Sorry.
questions? You're about to run out of time.
Okay, well, if you could
But-
come back to me if
Yep,
there's time
I will
later
indeed.
on.
If there's no more, I've got a
Thank
few
you.
questions I'd like to ask, and if there's time, I'll absolutely come back. So I wanted to maybe go into, you mentioned that we will be meeting with the UK Parliamentary Commissioner this evening, and in her submission to this committee, I'm not sure if you would have seen it, but the Commissioner for Standards, Catherine Stone, said to maximise its impact, any behavioural code needs to be drafted in simple terms and kept short. I understand that one of the reasons for Catherine Stone's emphasis on, I guess, simplicity and brevity there is the need that code is more likely to be read, understood, embedded into daily practice, be easily publicly displayed, all of these reasons. So I'm just wondering if you would agree that a code recommended by this committee, and as you know, Jenkins has tasked us with writing 3 at this moment, should be drafted in simple terms and kept short, because this is a point that is really being debated, I think, here. And that's the first part of the question, and I'll come back to a follow-up.
Sure. Yes, we would agree. I believe that submission also talked about the code needing to have enforceability. So we see the code as sort of having 2 broad objectives or pieces that comprise it. One is a discussion or I guess an articulation of values. So respect, inclusion, honesty is what our members have said is important to them to see parliamentarians conducting themselves by. The other part is a specific naming of behaviours that would be, I guess, against a code, so sexual assault, sexual harassment, that sort of thing. So yes, it needs to have values, but it also needs to have specific exclusions to be enforceable, but also taken up to create that culture change. We, I think to your question, Chair, we are advocating that the code is at more what we're calling a high level. So it's not going to be 20 pages of respect equals X, Y, Z within the code. The code would specify respect is a value, and then you could refer to a policy that underpins that speaks to what and defines what respect is. We think that's probably the cleanest way of doing it. As I mentioned before in our opening statement, part of that is to make sure that the code, which we believe should be legislated for, doesn't have to be touched, it's intact, but the policies can be updated as new information becomes available, as sort of new discussions around what could constitute respect or, disrespect, I suppose, to certain cohorts in particular come alive in public debates as well. Is there anything you wanted to add in there?
No, I think you've covered it.
Well, I'm just wondering because there is, there's a bit of tension between the use of positive values in articulating a code of conduct, and then the naming of unacceptable behaviours. So if I'm wondering if you think that I mean, it sounds to me that you're suggesting the high-level document should include both positive and the list of unacceptable or prohibitive kind of behaviours. And I'm just curious as to your thinking around whether a list of those unacceptable, but whether there's a danger in listing a lot of unacceptable behaviours in terms of it becoming so prescriptive that we unwittingly leave out other unacceptable forms of behaviour, or indeed behaviours that become unacceptable over time. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think it is, again, I think the solution here would be to have the policy. One of the things, I guess we had a similar sort of, thinking we had to go through in preparing this submission, and also in communicating to our members who are members of the public around this. And I suppose that the frame we're trying to look through and provide advice to the committee is very much that test of what will the public understand. So where we came to was that we talked about gendered misconduct as a term, and gendered misconduct could include a range of things from sexual harassment through to technologically facilitated abuse that's gendered in nature. So maybe you'd have a catch-all term that says gendered misconduct alongside other articulated behaviours that you wouldn't want, such as sexual assault, sexual harassment. But then you would have those defined again in a policy. So gendered misconduct might become more of like a sort of a catch-all or a broader term that you could then use to update. Of course, you still want to keep that relatively tight in terms of defining it. So it's not an absolute, I guess, sort of like not everything could come up against that. But that's certainly something that we found was quite useful in communicating to people and talking about the range of issues, because as you've said, Chair, they do change over time. Parliament now operates in a far more online environment than it ever did before. So we do have to keep pace with Parliament as a workplace and what that actually means in terms of where behaviour that's unacceptable can take place.
Yeah, I think we would probably defer to our peers with expertise in the legals around this, and I know that we've been speaking with the Human Rights Law Centre, so would be open to their recommendation on this. My assumption would be that we would see the prohibited behaviours as a list by way of example, and certainly not as an exhaustive list. In looking to values of respect and inclusion, I think we would see sexual violence, sexual harassment, discrimination as examples of clear breaches of that expectation.
Thank you. Just wondering, I wouldn't mind going to the question of you have, when you look at the scope of the codes, which is an important consideration of this committee, you've recommended that the codes apply to parliamentarians' personal lives where their conduct, and I'm quoting here, significantly damages the reputation and integrity of the Parliament. Why do you believe that personal lives are relevant to our workplace codes of conduct? And do you believe the codes for staff would also be, whether those rules would be applicable? I think, well, let's start with those.
Sure. Just a couple of questions. Yes, in terms of personal behaviour, and again, in our submission, we've talked about the UK Parliament, which has a precedent around including personal lives. And I'll quote, where such conduct significantly damages the reputation and integrity, in this case of the House of Commons as a whole, or of its members generally. So we do think that drawing on this UK example is a good thing for us to be thinking about here in Australia. Again, as I spoke about before, this really goes to the position and the influence and the expectations that the public have of parliamentarians. Parliamentarians are in highly visible and influential positions. I think it is relevant to, I think, to members of the public that parliamentarians' personal conduct, where it intersects with a breach, is relevant to be considered as a potential breach of the code and should potentially be referred to the IPSC. Of course, in our submission, we talked about the test, which looked a lot, most of the examples, in fact, all of the examples I think that we gave talked about parliamentarians and conduct that had happened in their personal lives. So there is a clear, I guess, synergy there. So for better or for worse, it's parliamentarians are in the public eye and their personal lives need to be considered. In terms of staff, we have not focused on staff in this submission, so I don't think we have a comment. If that's something the committee would like us to think about, we're happy to go away and do that.
No, I'm not setting homework.
Great.
I was
appreciate it.
just, it's an obvious question when there are 3 codes of conduct.
Absolutely.
What the kind of where there, are there fundamental kinds of, is there uniformity? Where do they differ? Why? Those are important questions, I guess, for the committee. And there are. I think you're right with the UK definition that the personal life aspect, because goodness knows, I think all of us would agree that there's such a blurring of personal and private for a member of Parliament that, when it goes to the issue of the UK qualification is significant damage, I think, to reputation and integrity. Anyway, thank you for that.
Sorry, Chair. Can I just add to that response? I think from our members' perspective, as you mentioned, MPs conducting a broad range of duties outside of Parliament and in their electorates, we think it's consistent with public expectations that people are often interacting with MPs in a way that they would expect is within the scope of their role within Parliament. I think we had also suggested language around the scope of the code as extending to any conduct relevant to a member's parliamentary duties as well, which we see as slightly distinct from the language in the UK code in that the threshold for the UK test of significant damage for the House or as a whole or the members generally may not be triggered, but where there might be, particularly where somebody holds higher duties on a committee or in a ministerial role, that conduct in their personal life may be relevant to their duties to an extent that we believe it should be covered by a code because it impacts on public trust and faith in their ability to conduct that particular role, although it may not be sufficient to bring the entirety of the Parliament into disrepute, if that distinction makes sense. And we're particularly conscious, I think, that as an organisation that advocates around gender-based violence, often allegations of conduct in that space are in the scope of somebody's personal life as well as in professional conduct. So we would want to ensure that where that is relevant to somebody's role or additional duties, whether or not that be a committee, a task force, a ministerial role, that is within the scope of the code to be reviewed by the IPSC.
Is it your view that only that comes into play when there is a breach or a question around the interaction with the code of conduct?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well,
Chair.
I'm just wondering, I'm sure the Finnish MP, who enjoyed a night off going and dancing, probably saw that as an activity in her private capacity, even though she's a public figure. It's now on the internet. Every person's got an opinion about it. But I'm not aware of it bringing, her Parliament into disrepute, although perhaps there is an argument for some there, I don't know. But, it is a very difficult line for somebody in public office to really ascertain, when they are public, when they are private. That's, an issue that everyone deals with every day.
Yeah.
So anyway, I am really just trying to tease out where those. I read the examples you gave in your submission, and I thank you for that. Those examples suggested to me that you thought this really becomes, there's an offence, a potential offence of a, proposed code of conduct, and therefore when you looked at a sanction regime, then the application, like things that are occurring outside of the parliamentary precinct itself perhaps, come into play. That's how I read your submission, and I don't want to misrepresent you.
I think maybe then to express how we've been thinking about it in an alternate way for clarity, I think that we say, for example, an allegation of sexual assault made against Parliamentarian X, we believe that that would be an allegation that Parliamentarian X had breached the Code of Conduct, and as such should be investigated by the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner as a potential breach of the Code of Conduct, that if it was found that a breach had occurred, that the IPSC would then be able to recommend sanctions, and that recommendation would take into account any additional duties that Parliamentarian X had, and if those were in any way relevant to policy around sexual violence, gender-based violence, gender equity, that a recommendation would take into account those, and I think we'd be of the opinion that sanctions should be specific to probably removing some, if not all, of the level of responsibility if another... Yep. Sorry,
That's
Lisa,
fine.
did you
Thank
want to
you.
add to that?
No, that's fine.
Excellent. I'll do one more quick one, go back to Senator Faruqi. I've got a couple more, but I'll see how we go for time. I'm interested in your second recommendation, which where you state that the code should be legislated. As you would well know, Jenkins has stipulated that the codes for staff are to be legislated, but the codes for parliamentarians should be added to the standing orders for each house. So I'd really appreciate if you step the committee through why it is that you regard legislation as being necessary.
Absolutely. So we believe, and we've put this in our submission, that the code will be binding all parliamentarians, and as such it should also sit with the Parliament to have the power to change the code. We also think the code needs to be future-proofed, so at the moment the ministerial standards, which is the closest thing arguably to a code at the moment, can be changed by the discretion of the Prime Minister. So having legislation, I guess it has very beneficial outcomes in making sure that the code is mandatory, making sure it is consistent and clear for all parliamentarians, making sure that's enforceable and implemented at all times, and it speaks to the values that underpin exemplary workplace standards, attitudes and behaviours, which is what we think we should be aiming for. I guess to elaborate a bit more, we've thought about this in the context of why standing orders are also not sufficient for the code. The main reasons around this is that standing orders are made and amended and also can be suspended by resolution of the relevant chamber. Again, we are a campaigning organisation. The lens in which we're approaching this is thinking through the eyes of the public and what the public will understand. And so we do worry that the impression that standing orders, which would include a code being suspended, could be seen as very problematic, doesn't necessarily send the right message, even though we know some of these things are just very procedural in nature. Standing orders, again, can also be changed by majority vote. So there's actually no guarantee of consistency for a code that isn't embedded across Parliament. So very, very quickly and easily you could see that if a new party, for instance, or multiple parties form a government, obviously they have control of the lower house, they could change the standing orders, which means changing the code that affects the House of Representatives versus, the Senate, which, generally over recent history or longer, arguably has been far more diverse. I I guess that the other thing, though, that we talk about in a democracy more broadly is the importance of checks and balances, and that's why we have two chambers. So again, having a code that is legislated for means that a majority in both chambers has to agree to a change that impacts all parliamentarians. So we want to make sure there's clarity and there's consistency. All parliamentarians are held to the same standards. This is consistent with what Dr. Haynes recommended in the Commonwealth Parliamentary Standards Bill that she introduced in 2020. It's also supported by groups such as Transparency International, who talk about this as best practice for democracies across the world. And again, going back to the perspective of the public, we think that this will restore trust and confidence in the public that the Parliament is being kept to a standard, and that standard is, again, clear and consistent.
So I think the objectives that we are kind of seeing as primary around clarity, consistency and future-proof, and we have some questions about whether or not that can be achieved through standing orders. Obviously, we're not experts in procedure, so I suppose that's probably our key concern and a question for the committee to consider.
Thank you. I'll check in, just checking in with the others if there are any questions here. The obvious follow-up there, though, is the same Parliament can change legislation.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, and I suppose I guess we don't want to be thinking about the code as something that never changes, right? It's just the threshold to where that change takes place. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll hand back to Senator Faruqi.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back to the question of prohibitive behaviour, and I want to go back to it because there has been some resistance in here, the idea of including racism, transphobia, homophobia, and a couple of other discriminatory behaviours in the code of conduct itself. These are types of discrimination that are faced by marginalized groups and which are often ignored. So I just want to ask you again, I guess, do you think that it is really important to have these behaviors as prohibited behaviors in the code of conduct? Because, as you said, they could be including this behavior, so it's not an exhaustive list. But what we know now should at least be included in there.
Yes, absolutely. I think, similar to our comments before, we do think that these should be explicitly named. Again, I suppose how we think about set the standard and the lens, and I guess how that report came to be was through the lens of gender-based violence. But if we're thinking about just gender-based violence, and we're generally speaking about women who disproportionately experience that type of violence, we cannot have proper protections for all women unless we also consider other types of inequities and discrimination. I think we've been quite clear about that in our submission. So it would be a glaring omission for the code, not to include these other types of discriminations, because it's actually not going to the heart of addressing what Set the Standard has set out to do. So absolutely, Senator, I don't know if I can say it in any other words, but we certainly think it should be included. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to make for the committee to have a clear understanding because, like I said, there has been resistance to including those in there.
Senator Faruqi, I'm not sure that you can say that, but go ahead.
Well, you can look at transcripts, Chair, but we'll move on. Could I ask if there should be in the code like a positive, proactive duty to call out such unacceptable behaviours? And I looked at the New Zealand Code of Conduct, and that has a point in there which says, speak up if we observe unacceptable behaviour. Do you think that's something proactive that should be included in the code?
We haven't looked at that specifically, Senator. Certainly we understand from the Set the Standard report, Commissioner Jenkins talks about active bystander training and the need to include that for parliamentarians and staff and people in the parliamentary precinct. I suppose it's, again, something we could go and consider. I don't know if it would necessarily be included in the code. in terms of keeping the code very high level, but potentially in a policy. Again, though, I think it is a fair thing to consider in terms of creating the behaviour and the attitudinal change, which we know is the hardest thing to change and is critical to culture change. So certainly something of merit for the committee to consider, but we don't have a specific position on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Your submission also talks about this, that one of the tests of the code's efficacy is how it would have dealt with the misconduct that arose in the 46th Parliament. So I'm just interested to know about other ways that we could kind of measure the code's success. I mean, and I know that code is one part, only one part of changing the culture, but should the code also be one part of changing the makeup of Parliament, for instance? We know how little diversity, for instance, there is in Parliament. And should that be one of the kind of success factors we should be looking at for the code to do?
It's an interesting point, Senator. I suppose in terms of other tests, I don't think we have any other tests to offer the committee to think about other than what we've included in the submission. But to your broader point around diversity, Set the Standard talks, extensively, and many of the recommendations talk about the need for a 10-year strategy, reporting on diversity for that, parliamentarian staff. Again, as we spoke about before, embedding this in training around inclusion and respect. And we keep coming back to inclusion and respect as the key values that our members told us about they'd like to see included in a code. So I guess we think it would be all part of that conversation. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, both. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. Of course, there are a number of the recommendations from the Jenkins report goes to the work of political parties, or in the case of people that aren't represented by parties, the pre-selection processes more broadly that need to be really considered. I might, just while we've got some time, just ask another question around the, your submission says that the code should apply differently to parliamentarians with additional or different kinds of parliamentary responsibilities, and I'm just wondering if do you think that this is something that the proposed IPSC should consider? And are you suggesting that the code should replace the ministerial code of conduct? And if not, I'm wondering then what you think is the interface between a ministerial code of conduct and what this other code of conduct for parliamentarians would be.
Absolutely. So in terms of the additional responsibilities of parliamentarians, this is part of the reason we do think that the IPSC should have a broad range of sanctions. So those sanctions can be, I suppose, recommended in a proportionate way. And proportionality does need to consider the additional responsibilities. Again, in the test and I suppose the examples that we include in the submission, you can clearly see the links between a parliamentarian's position, their role and responsibilities, and how that aligns with the alleged breaches of what we would think would be in a code. So there's some synergy there. What was the second part of your question? Sorry, Chair.
I think the first was should this be something that the IPSC considers?
Yes.
Really about whether there are different types of, codes being applied or different standards perhaps being applied to people who have additional responsibilities as part of their parliamentary work.
Yes, sorry, and the ministerial standards.
Yes. And so current you've got, a code of ministerial standards. It's one that applies to staff, to ministerial staff, sorry. But if this committee does what has been asked of it, and that is produces an additional 3 codes of conduct, I'm interested to know, what you would see as the interface maybe between those.
Yes, sorry, Chair. Thank you for clarifying that. We haven't looked specifically at the ministerial standards other than to, I suppose, note that it's not adequate because it only deals with a certain cohort within Parliament. So we see the code as, again, it's that baseline, it's that the clarity and consistency, again, of all parliamentarians that need to be held by. If there is, I suppose, a decision around other types of values or other types of behaviours that should be articulated for parliamentarians that have additional duties, perhaps that would fall under a ministerial code or a ministerial standard. Don't think we have a specific position on that. What we're really advocating for is a very strong code that is, I don't want to say it's the minimum in terms of what's unacceptable, but really we're trying to think through this, as I said at the start, through a strengths-based lens of what would the Australian public expect and want to see from the Australian Parliament, which is an exemplar of a workplace in Australia.
Yeah, I think to add to that, one of the things that we discussed in putting forward that recommendation was the additional responsibilities beyond ministerial roles. So the examples of, a committee chair or a head of a task force that we think our members and the general public would see as bringing additional responsibilities and being relevant to the conduct that they would be expecting from a member of Parliament. And so we, would want to see the IPSC considering that, particularly regarding recommended sanctions if somebody with additional responsibilities was found to have breached the code.
They certainly have more opportunity, without preempting anything the IPSC may wish to consider. It doesn't exist yet, but you've certainly got more options if there are different roles in terms of the sorts of sanctions you can apply. Indeed. Anyway, I thank you both very much for your evidence.
Yeah, sorry, it's Maureen. I just have one more question. There's a bit of time, so if I could ask one more question.
One more.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Just in your submission, you have included quotes from your members, and one of those quotes raises, I think, a very important point, that there must be no unintended consequences that harm victim survivors. So what can we do to ensure that that can happen, that the complaints and the enforcement processes which accompany the code don't, put the welfare of those who have been targeted as a priority?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I suppose what we talked about briefly in the opening statement was this interaction between the Parliamentary Workplace Support Service, so many acronyms, PWSS, and the recommendations in Jenkins that would come under the IPSC. So there's a definite need to look really carefully at how the PWSS supports the IPSC with any investigations that relate to allegations, particularly of sexual assault or sexual harassment, but more broadly, as we said, any allegations that could be seen to be quite traumatic in nature. We know that from a gender-based violence perspective, and it was noted again in Set the Standard, that there's a lot of impacts for victim survivors that can range from, anxiety to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So it is extremely important that any process centres the victim survivor, has wraparound support. The Foster Review, we noted, talked about confidential, timely, trauma-informed services. We would reiterate that is absolutely necessary. The complexity here is making sure that you're doing that in a way that supports the victim survivor, but also, is still supporting a process of investigation if that's what's happening. We are not service delivery experts or trauma experts in terms of how that would play out, but it is critical that sort of setting is really thoroughly considered. I hope that answers your question, Senator.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think that we would be conscious of wanting to make sure that the trauma-informed process and expertise in responding to gender-based violence was not only in place in the services that were supporting the victim, but also ensured through any investigation process as relevant. And the other particular example I think that we would give, having raised ourselves, we think the importance of transparency around findings and sanctions only with the informed consent of the person who has been affected. So we support transparency, but only when there is consent from the person affected.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Fruki. And again, thank you both very much for appearing today.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
And I do need to just remind you that if you have taken any questions on notice, that the Secretariat has asked for those responses to be provided by the 10th of October to assist us in our deliberations. Thank you. And we are just a couple of minutes ahead, but I will proceed to the next witness now. Thank you both. I'll give you a moment to move your papers, and then I will invite Professor Andrew Podger to the table. Thank you. I'll give you a moment to just settle there, Professor, and we will be underway. Are you good to go?
Yes. Fine.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Then I shall now formally welcome you, Professor Andrew Podger. I understand that the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been provided to you?
Yes.
Thank you. And for the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today?
Andrew Stewart Podger. I'm coming here on a personal level. I'm not representing an organisation.
Thank you. And I'd now like to invite you to make a short opening statement. And at the conclusion of that statement, I'll invite committee members to ask questions. Everyone else is online, so you hopefully can see the screens and we'll be able to... But I'll invite you to make a short opening statement first. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My submission to the committee is based on my long experience as a senior public servant and my experience as both APS Commissioner and Parliamentary Service Commissioner. Much of my work since leaving the APS has been on the roles, responsibilities and capabilities of various institutions in our democracy, particularly but not solely those of the civil service. The advent and increasing role of ministerial staff has had a major impact over the last 30 years. This committee has the opportunity to assist in clarifying the way different institutions of government contribute and work together and how they should be held responsible. In doing so, it can also contribute to the implementation of the recommendations of the Thodey Independent Review of the APS, which the previous government sadly rejected. While the context of the committee's task to prepare a code of conduct for those working in the Parliament is the Jenkins report and associated allegations of bullying and harassment and worse, the conduct that should be expected of public officials, both elected and not elected, goes well beyond not bullying or harassing. The public surely expects much more, including care and diligence, personal integrity, and appropriate use of public resources in the public interest. While there may be advantages in having a single common code of conduct for everyone working in the Parliament, it is essential to recognise that different groups have different responsibilities. Some are elected, some are not. Some work in the executive arm of government, others in the legislature. A useful way of clarifying distinct responsibilities is to articulate each group's values or principles. This is the approach already used in the Public Service Act for APS employees and the Parliamentary Service Act for Parliamentary Service employees, where the values reflect their different lines of accountability while also revealing many common features. My submission suggests an approach that would clarify the respective responsibilities of ministers, other members and senators, ministerial staff, and staff of members and senators. Having established more clearly the responsibilities of the different groups through articulating their respective values or principles, complementary codes of conduct could then be prepared. The existing codes for the Parliamentary Service and the APS provide a useful template, demonstrating that in most respects the codes would be the same. My preference would be to have the statements of values and the codes of conduct in legislation, but it would be possible to have those for ministers and ministerial staff, where they vary from those for members and senators and their staff, to be issued by the Prime Minister and tabled in the Parliament. In terms of oversight and administrative support, I suggest some minor variations to the Jenkins report recommendations, drawing more heavily on the Foster report. In particular, I recommend that the Parliamentary Service Commissioner, who reports to the presiding officers, be given responsibility for Members of Parliament Staff Act employees as well as the Parliamentary Service employees. Now, the current practice of the APS Commissioner also being the Parliamentary Service Commissioner cease. There is much the Commissioner could do to explain and promote the values and codes of conduct, getting onto the front foot and not relying excessively on any sanctions for breaches of the codes of conduct. I do not believe, however, that the Parliamentary Service Commissioner should have any role in overseeing members or senators or ministers. That should be with the Jenkins proposed Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission. Finally, I share the views of Dr Val Barrett and Dr Maria Maley that the Parliament lacks a strong leadership group that can protect and nurture the Parliament as our central institution of the democracy. Our adversarial politics tends to leave a vacuum, which the presiding officers struggle to fill. Some form of parliamentary commission, including the main party leaders in both chambers as well as the presiding officers, could be given a stronger role in the management of the Parliament, drawing on UK experience. I do not see such a commission as a new management layer or requiring substantial secretariat support. Rather, its primary role would be as an advocate for the Parliament and lending support to the presiding officers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I will open up to committee members for questions, and I'll ask Senator Faruqi if she has any questions.
I do have a few questions. Thanks, Chair. And thank you, Professor Podger, for coming in to give evidence. I mean, we know that history has shown us that establishing codes of conduct for members in the Australian Parliament has been a pretty difficult process. We haven't got there yet. We hopefully will very soon. And, you know, it all depends on political will. It also, how strong our codes of conduct are will also depend on political will and how they're implemented as well. So given that, what do you think is the role of the leaders of political parties to ensure that the codes actually are successful in achieving what we hope is part of a big culture change? And what do the roles of, you mentioned positions like the Senate President and the House Speaker, what sort of role should they play, as well as maybe chair of committees that was mentioned by the previous witnesses? What sort of roles should they play, and what support and training do they require to play those roles?
I think I would expect that the various leaders in this Parliament would see one of their roles is to promote values and codes of conduct, not just to uphold them, so that there would be a role there. That role is primarily a role to promote amongst the members and senators more generally, and you would hope that would also lead to some promotion for the staff of members and senators and ministerial staff elsewhere. But I've suggested also a role for the Parliamentary Service Commissioner with respect to the officials who are not elected. If I look back on my time as Public Service Commissioner and those who followed me in that role, the Public Service Commissioner has developed a whole series of guidance and support and training and education for public servants and for leaders of the public service in understanding and acting on the values and code of conduct. In particular, a lot of work went into ensuring that the values were not seen as just rhetorical, but were seen as issues of substance that needed to be thought of carefully. And amongst the work that was done to promote the role of agency heads and senior executive staff across the public service was to clarify that following the values requires leadership, it requires management, and it requires assurance. And under each of those three headings, there are things you can do that are very tangible to promote the values and the code of conduct. Those are the sorts of things that I would expect the Parliamentary Service Commissioner to be able to do, both for the Parliamentary Service, but also for the Members of Parliament Staff Act employees.
the code of conduct, obviously it would identify, behavior that should not be tolerated. But you also spoke about care and diligence. Do you think that should be part of that code? Like positive behavior should be part of that code? And also maybe if I can add another question to that, a positive duty on people who the code applies to. For instance, the New Zealand code has something that says, speak up if we observe unacceptable behavior. Do you think those sorts of things in the code of conduct would actually be helpful?
First of all, the code of conduct, in my very strong view, has to go well beyond the issue of bullying and harassing and those sorts of bad behaviour. I think it ought to reflect the responsibilities and duties of people who work in this Parliament. And the fact that this Parliament has provided within 2 sets of legislation values and codes of conduct, and the codes of conduct are extremely similar for the public service and the parliamentary service, there are only very minor differences between them, suggests that there is a template there that could be used for other people working in this Parliament, both elected and the staff of elected parliamentarians. On the specific issue you raised at the end there about how the code could phrase the issue around not bullying and harassing, I put in my submission some suggested words that came from the Canadians, which does go further than the words we currently have in the legislation for the public service or the parliamentary service. I'll just see if I can find those words. Those words were that harassment, violence and discrimination will not be tolerated, condoned or ignored. I think wording of that sort would pick up the point you're raising about the wording used in New Zealand as well.
Speaking up, yeah. Thank you for that. Your submission, and I think you kind of mentioned that in your opening statement as well, that the committee should develop distinct but closely related sets of values for members and senators, ministers, MOPS Act employees, and members and senators, MOPS Act employees of members and senators, and employees of ministers, reflecting their different roles and responsibility. I was just wondering if you had a view on, because all these roles are quite different and responsibilities are quite different, should there be a difference in terms of what sanctions and what consequences these various employees, members and senators have to face for breaching the code?
I think there will have to be some difference. The main distinction I've suggested is that the oversight of the values and codes of conduct for those who are not elected should be managed through the Parliamentary Service Commissioner. But I don't think the Parliamentary Service Commissioner, the sort of person who fills that role, would be suited to overseeing the behaviours of members and senators. I think that is a distinction I would make, and that is where the IPSC plays a role. And I think associated with that, the sort of sanctions would be quite different. I think that the issue of sanctions for parliamentarians would have to be thought through very carefully, quite distinct, I would have thought, from people who are not elected.
Thank you very much, Professor Podger. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. If others online wish to have any questions, please let me know. But I'd like to just start with a couple myself. Thanks, Professor Podger. You've suggested that there might be different values for parliamentarians, ministers, parliamentarians, staff and ministerial staff. And if I've understood you correctly, but many witnesses have in fact raised with us a view that having desperate kinds of measures and a lack of consistency might be confusing, that it might be exasperating existing power inequities in those different roles, and might not be conducive to driving the long-term cultural change that we want. So we've got a situation now where ministers and their staff have a code of conduct, and I and wondering what you would see as the disadvantage then of having a singular code of conduct for parliamentarians and a singular code of conduct for staff, which is what Jenkins is sort of steering us towards. I'm just trying to understand why you think that's such a disadvantage.
Let me clarify some of the distinctions and start off by saying, if you look at the value statements in the legislation for the public service and the parliamentary service, there's a great deal of commonality, but there are important distinctions. The parliamentary service is serving the parliament. The public service is subject to ministerial responsibility provisions. They are quite different. But that doesn't mean that the vast majority of the values are exactly the same. But if I look at members of parliament staff employees, both ministerial and staff of senators and members, they also have slightly different values, and rightly so, from the public service. For example, the public service is required to be non-partisan and impartial. We don't expect the staff of ministers and members and senators that they must not be members of parties or have party allegiance, whereas that sense of non-partisanship and impartiality we do expect from both the parliamentary service and the public service. Now, what I'm saying is that the values and the codes of conduct, a template can be very, very much a common template, but it is useful to clarify where there are differences, because the differences are not unimportant. These differences between who is partisan and who is allowed to be, must be non-partisan, is important. Lines of accountability is a line of accountability through ministers is different from the line of accountability through presiding officers and to the Parliament. Similarly, what do you have to hold? What papers should be held confidential and how? A public servant, confidentiality is around working with ministers. It's a different sense of confidentiality than you would expect in other places. But the idea of a provision around confidentiality ought to be in all of them. But there will be minor variations which reflect these important differences in roles and responsibilities. So I'm hoping that what I'm putting on the table here is you can have a common template, and you've got a common template. The template of the code of conduct in those two pieces of legislation are extremely similar, but the variations in it are important. And I think that is also important. There will be variations between the elected and unelected, and there will be variations between the MOP staff and those in the parliamentary service and the public service.
Thank you. You have recommended the Parliamentary Service Commissioner investigates alleged breaches of staff codes of conduct, as I understand it, but you'd have a Parliamentary Standards Commissioner for alleged breaches of a parliamentarian's code or indeed ministerial codes. I'm just wondering how you would see, why you think that's important to have two different systems, and whether or not that might prove challenging for persons trying to navigate their way, the complainant trying to navigate their way through a couple of systems.
However you do it, there's going to be some issue of navigation. I guess I would argue that what I put forward has less problems of navigation than the Jenkins one. I mean, you've already got a Parliamentary Service Commissioner, you've already got, most recently, action taken under the Jenkins report to provide some responsibilities for the Parliamentary Service Commissioner in respect of MOP staff. So there's been a shift already in that area, and my suggestion is, picking up from the Foster report, that building on that would actually be very sensible, and essentially saying that if you're not elected, well then you're handled by this process. If you are elected, you're handled by the other process, I think is easier to explain. And I suspect that parliamentarians wouldn't feel very happy about having, however experienced a former public servant, whoever it is as Parliamentary Service Commissioner, being the person looking at them. I don't think that's going to be the right sort of person there. But equally, I don't think you need the sort of person you would need for a parliamentarian to be looking at a non-elected official. So I see the point being raised, but I think any structure is going to have some issue of navigation, and I suggest to you that my structure proposed would have less navigation problems, be clearer than the one that's being currently pursued.
Professor, can I just take you back to the language you reminded us of? Well, I'm not sure, it was in your submission. I remember noting myself that you thought that the codes should include a requirement about treating everyone with respect to outlaw tolerating, condoning or ignoring harassment, violence or discrimination. And I'm not sure where that came from. I think you were referencing one of the other codes, but you can correct me if that's not the case. And I'd like you to talk us through why you think that some clearly strong wording there, which is, there is a tension between, I think, wanting to call out different forms of discriminatory or exclusionary behaviours and some hesitancy. I think Senator Faruqi was sort of alluding to this earlier around, if that, without unwittingly excluding any behaviours, if you start listing a range of prohibited behaviours, that you wouldn't want to unwittingly exclude a prohibited behaviour, or indeed not be able to, to have it future-proof that you wouldn't be excluding something that's not even part of the lexicon right now. So those words around outlawing, tolerating, to forbid tolerating, condoning or ignoring harassment, violence or discrimination, do you think that that type of high-level language would adequately deal with those concerns that that all forms of discrimination, I mean, we have laws in Australia about this, but all forms of discrimination are to be, would be deemed prohibited behaviours, and likewise acts of violence or I think this goes to your question that you weren't happy that a reference to bullying, harassment and that was enough, and that it needed to be stronger language. I'm trying to
I guess where I was coming from is that the concerns that came out of the Jenkins report might suggest that the words in the current codes of conduct for public servants and for parliamentary service employees do not go far enough. And if that was the view, that they don't go far enough, and that's the background to this committee's work, then you might want to look at words that are used elsewhere. And the words I put in my submission came from Canada. They are the words that a person who is a equivalent of a MOPS employee must sign when they take up a job in Canada.
It becomes like a terms of employment.
Become a terms of employment. That's where those words came from. Now, I use the word outlaw down the line in my submission, but the words I suggested be used in the Code of Conduct is that harassment, violence and discrimination will not be tolerated, condoned or ignored. Basically, it means the same as outlawing it, but
yes,
the word outlaw wasn't going to be in there. I don't know enough to know exactly what is the best form of words here, but I suspect the words we currently have in the codes for the public service and the parliamentary service could be usefully strengthened. And I've just given an illustration of what might be done in that respect. And
we've got an opportunity, because we don't have codes here in Parliament at all, to be able to kind of, ensure that they are the best, they can be. But making sure that they don't date too quickly, that they are adequately covering all forms of discrimination.
The words in the codes of conduct that exist that I'm suggesting be the template go into a lot of other areas which I think ought to apply, and I don't see why they wouldn't apply. And amongst them is, in fact, complying with the law. So you've got that more general catch-all within those. So that would, as you mentioned, refer to discrimination law or any other laws. But I think this issue of workplace relations in particular that we're getting at here, of the dangers of bullying and harassment, and trying to act more firmly against that. The Canadian suggestion seems to me one way of strengthening the wording that I've suggested be the main template.
No, thank you very much. I will just check. Senator Faruqi, have you any further questions? No? That's fine. Thank you so much, Professor Podger. I know that if there is any, if you have taken questions on notice, that we've just asked that any responses being provided to the Secretariat by the 10th of October. But I'd certainly appreciate your evidence here today and your long experience, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
And the committee will now break until 5 p.m. Thanks. Today's hearing via video conference are representatives from the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, Mr Matthew Salek, Heads of Programs, and representatives of the Accountability Roundtable, Adjunct Professor Kenneth Coghill and Professor Charles Sanford. I welcome you all to the hearing today, and I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been provided to you. I'm just making sure that's been the case. Great, thank you.
Yes, that's correct, yes.
So just for the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? And I will come back to invite opening comments after that, but we'll just get introductions done for the record first, if you don't mind. Perhaps Mr Salek, you might like to go first.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Matthew Salek. I'm the Head of Programmes at the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Headquarters Secretariat.
Thank you.
My name is Ken Coghill, and I'm speaking as a member and director of the Accountability Roundtable.
Thank you. And just for the benefit of those on the video link, we've had to join Professor Coghill via teleconference now. Sorry about that. The technology doesn't always behave as we would like. And sorry, and perhaps back to you, Professor Charles Sanford.
Yes, Professor Charles Sanford, Foundation Dean of Law and Research Professor at Ethics at Griffith University, and here as a director of the Accountability Roundtable.
Terrific, thank you. Is that okay? That's not right. Everyone's not here. Anyway, thank you very much. I just invite, I know there are two separate organisations being represented here, so I am going to invite an opportunity for you both to make some opening remarks, and then I'll go to committee members to ask questions after that. So I don't mind which order it goes in, perhaps the order of appearance, which would put the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association up first. Mr. Salek, do you have some opening remarks that you might like to make?
Thank you, Chair. I'll just be very brief, just to introduce the organisation that I represent, which might be useful, and some of the work that we've done. I'm obviously, as mentioned, Head of Programmes at the CPA. The CPA is representative of 180 Commonwealth parliaments, both national and subnational, and that obviously includes the Commonwealth of Australia, and all the subnational parliaments of Australia. And I should also say that Honourable Sue Lyons is a member of our executive committee, recently appointed at the last Commonwealth Parliamentary Conference. The CPA has been established for over 112 years, initially the Empire Parliamentary Association, but we've moved on since that time. And over the last decade or so, and with the help of Professor Coghill and Professor Sanford, we've done a great deal of work around codes of conduct and about codes of ethics in terms of developing a benchmarks to assist parliaments in developing their own codes of conduct and codes of ethics. And I'll very much leave the professors to both add content to that in more detail than I can. But we do a lot of work with parliaments around the Commonwealth to help establish those codes of conduct, but also to help train parliamentarians to become more cognizant of their own codes of conduct and to develop a higher standard of ethics and behaviour. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Salek, I did not mention this earlier, but I really do need to just pop it on the record because you're joining us from the United Kingdom. Just to note, as was noted in your invitation, that parliamentary privilege applies only to people giving evidence in Australia. And parliamentary privilege is a special right that means you cannot be prosecuted or disadvantaged because of anything you've provided in evidence that has been accepted by the committee or because you gave this evidence. However, because this privilege only applies to within Australia, a person outside of Australia will not be protected by parliamentary privilege. And I should have noted that before your opening comments, but hopefully you're comfortable in having made those. Thank you very much. And I'd invite Professor, well, who would like to go next? Sorry.
I think
we discussed it, and maybe I might,
okay.
Ken and I thought,
Thanks,
I'm going to
Professor
speak more generally.
Sanford.
But firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Yes, I've worked with them, and they were kind enough to ask me to do a masterclass in parliamentary ethics, which is on the web, filmed in Westminster and in Queensland. But obviously, we're talking about the various parliamentary codes here. I want to make just very few points that I make generally in terms of integrity systems. That firstly, we don't want to just pick up on best practice. We should aim to go beyond best practice, both in the various elements of what we do about parliamentary ethics, and also in the degree of integration, the degree to which various measures are mutually reinforcing and therefore making it stronger. The next thing I'd want to emphasise is that codes should first of all state values and start from positive statements of ethics about how we want people to behave, rather than just merely stating the ways in which they can misbehave. So that, for instance, and several of the codes that Ken and I cite talk about the requirement to treat all with dignity, courtesy, and respect. And then things like harassment, bullying, assault, and so forth are very, very the opposite of it. But we should start with how we expect our parliamentarians and those who hold public trust to behave, and then we, of course, very clearly state those cases in which they misbehave. So it's not just about outlawing bad behaviour, but encouraging good behaviour. Another thing that we'd emphasise is there are two kinds of institutions that are really important here. One of them we call an ethics counsellor, somebody who can give advice, confidential advice. We go into detail. It was basically a Canadian idea, and we pressed for its introduction in Queensland. It's called the Integrity Commissioner there, but we use the Canadian term ethics counsellor because to avoid confusion with other institutions. And it's about giving confidential advice to parliamentarians and indeed various senior public servants about the behaviour that's expected of them. And then separately, we sometimes call it an ethics commissioner, but we've decided to go with the broader Commonwealth parliamentary term of an independent parliamentary standards commission. But the role of this, of course, is that to investigate unethical behaviour, so that but you keep the two roles quite separate. You don't want your solicitor to be your judge, or vice versa. Similarly, things you want the ethics counsellor to whom you can go and get confidential advice. But if you've actually your behaviour is called into question, then it's going to be a separate body to investigate, and of course to take it then to the Privilege Committee, and the Privilege Committee then take it to the Parliament. But of course, the independent determination that there is something wrong is actually something that is hard, therefore, for Privilege Committees or Houses of Parliament to ignore. So that's the model, and we emphasise the different role. We've also gone into considerable detail about the approach to that the ethics counsellor should take, how they handle advice and so forth, which I think is too much detail for an introductory statement. And the other thing, 2 points, would say that this is part of an integrity system, or as the Attorney General called it yesterday, the integrity framework. Is something that it's a part of it, and that these two commissions we suggest should be a part of the integrity system. And the other thing is that all key integrity agency heads, like the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner or the Ethics Counsellor or those from the NAC or Ombudsman and so forth, should be appointed by a bipartisan process in which the government cannot determine who the person is, as a great way to ensure greater trust. And there's particularly here, of course, where you're suggesting that that the ethics counsellor gives advice to parliamentarians. You want to have confidence that they have the support and confidence of both sides of Parliament, and similarly if there are any investigations by the IPSC. So those are my introductory comments, and I hope I didn't go too long.
No, thank you very much, Professor Samford. And I'm just checking, sorry, Professor Coghill, you were deferring to Professor Samford for the opening remarks?
No, only to the order in which we spoke.
Oh, sorry. Okay, well, let me go to Professor Coghill and then I'll go to questions of the committee.
In fairness, I have to say that Charles has covered things pretty comprehensively. I suppose I would simply want to emphasise that the way in which codes operate is as much a matter of the culture which exists within the group of people involved, the parliamentarians in this case, as it is in the structure. So it's very much a matter of designing a comprehensive system which is comprehensive across all types of misconduct, and which is comprehensive in the way in which it is administered and carries out its role.
Thank you very much. I will go to committee members now to just invite questions. And Ms Marino, I'm calling on you first.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today. Really appreciate your input and your submissions, particularly the clarity around the expectations and what can be put in place. I think your focus on natural justice is particularly important to us in relation to MPs in particular. And I'm really interested to know where this steps 1 and 2 with the Ethics Counsellor and then the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission, how well that is working in practice where it's being deployed, please. Are you getting, really good behaviours and good processes for people to use?
Well, actually, it's the combination of the two was actually suggested by the Canadian Attorney General way back in the early 90s. It was a brilliant idea which we've pushed forward, but they actually, in the end, only appointed the Ethics Counsellor, didn't ask him any questions about the ethical behaviour about advice, and then ask him to do retrospective investigations around ethical behaviour. So on the whole, I'm not sure that, there are various places that have an independent investigator and various places an independent advisor. Ken might give me an example, but I don't know of anybody who's actually properly carried out the original idea. But the original idea is a very, very strong one. So I think it would to have an effective IPSC and an effective ethics counsellor would be a tremendous achievement. So, for instance, Queensland's got a very good integrity commissioner and no IPSC, and I think the Commons is pretty well the other way around. But Ken would know better than I.
Look, thanks for that. And I would draw attention to the British experience of the House of Commons since 2009, when the Daily Telegraph exposed a whole lot of conduct which was regarded very poorly. And they have adopted a series of reforms which are similar to what we have proposed, not exactly the same, but very similar. And the level of misconduct detected and investigated has fallen dramatically, so much so when I looked at a recent listing of the sorts of cases that had been dealt with by the Commissioner, what I found was that the number had collapsed in number, but also collapsed in the severity or the significance of the sorts of cases that were being investigated. And, for example, there were a couple there which were simply investigating whether a member, or two members in this case, had each misused their House of Commons letterhead to seek some personal advantage. Now, that's a significant thing to be doing. It's clearly misconduct, but it's not anywhere near the sort of misconduct that was being reported before the 2009 revolution.
Thank you. Just Chair, I'll just ask a further question. Given the issues that you say that are being dealt with, how far does this go into members' private lives in particular, and also into their online activities? Does it reflect any of their pre-parliamentary life, and does it involve pre or existing online contributions, please?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, it has not involved the prior to being a member of Parliament conduct. Have I understood that question correctly?
Yes, you have. Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I
So
just
was
jump
there
in, Jim?
a
I think
part of the question which I've failed to answer so far?
Look, I was looking, we've had some evidence around, the fact that as public figures, MPs have, a range of, it's difficult often to separate their private lives and their public lives, but equally now we operate in a world of being online and as well. And I was wondering whether, there's been any need for the Commissioner or an ethics counsellor or anyone that you're aware of that's had to deal with issues around online activities of MPs or senators or representatives or senior public servants.
Look, not that springs to mind. I don't say it hasn't happened. I just can't call a case in mind.
I think our recommendation probably would be, if I can, I think that is that these are sort of questions that need to be considered in the initial code and in reviewing the code. I think codes need to be reviewed based upon sort of past practice, and I think that it's very important to renew it when new issues come up. As far as sort of comments online and so forth, I was once on a board and Henry Bosch said that any minute is any minute is a communication to an unknown judge for an unknown circumstance, and so in a sense, I think that politicians and so forth, that everybody needs to be careful about what they say. And the fact that it's being recorded and probably will stay on the internet for eternity is an extra reason to be careful about what one says. But as to whether it's a breach of the code, that's something that should be considered initially and should be reconsidered as we get to, as the Integrity Commissioner and the Ethics Counsellor and the IPSC have experience. They will feed in and will improve the code as time goes by.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Ms Marino. I'm just looking, I'm not sure. Senator Faruqi, do you have any questions? Yes?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I do have questions. Thank you and good evening, everyone. I might start off with the Accountability Roundtable. And you, in your submission, you have talked about the importance of ongoing training. In fact, both the submissions have. And I just wanted to ask that, especially for Accountability Roundtable, in your submission, you state that attendance in such training should be a condition of payment of certain allowances. So can you tell us why I mean, it kind of makes the training mandatory, which from my perspective is good, but why should it be mandatory? Why should it be ongoing? Why is that so important in ensuring the success of codes and changing workplace culture more broadly?
Well, I suppose it comes from research that I have done internationally as well as in Australia. And I'm acutely aware of how busy members of parliament and senators are, and that makes it difficult at times to make the decision to attend a training program rather than attend to some political crisis. So it's really based on my observations and the sorts of findings which I've had from research that I've done in a wide range of mostly national parliaments, in which the members of parliament have in some cases obviously varies from individual to individual and according to the circumstances of individuals, but it's often been difficult for some members to find the time to participate in training programs. But in any event, I think that it's really important that these are ongoing, much in the way in which many of the professions now have continuing professional development requirements. And that's the sort of model that I would be looking to as an example of a community standard which should be adopted by members of parliament and senators.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Can I just follow up, and something Ken says is really important. We fully recognise how busy people can be, and especially when they come into Parliament, and also when it comes to ministerial standards, how busy they are when they first come back into government, and they find that, and they've often got short-staffed because the staffing takes a while to organise, and then they've got to fill in this interest form and so forth, and they really don't have time. There are a number of the Howard ministers, one I know in particular, who actually I don't think for one moment holding some bank shares was intended to to profit. It's just that if he'd gone through his conflict of his statement of interest form, he should have known it. But actually much better is that you've got somebody from the Ethics Counsellor's office who will sit down next to him or her and go through their assets to tell which ones they need to declare, which ones, which most of them, which ones they need to declare, what they can do about them if there's a problem, whether they can put them in a trust and so forth. And there's something the Office of Government Ethics did with every presidential appointment. Now, this was first and foremost to avoid embarrassment, but on the other hand, it's a very good, for as an educator, it's a very good educational tool to sit down one-on-one education in matters that are important to them and in which they get instant advice and which they can come back for further advice later. And so I think that we want to give them incentives and also give them opportunities to be able to learn.
Mm-hmm. I guess that's just one training.
If I could just follow on, I'm sorry, Chair.
Yes.
I was going to say that it's also really important for members of parliament to take the opportunity to meet maybe once a year with the ethics counsellor, just to run through the sorts of issues that the member or senator is encountering and to discuss any which may have some potential risks to the career or the well-being of the minister. The member or the senator.
Okay, I just want to go to the ethics counsellor, and then I'll come back to another question on training. I guess I'm interested in knowing what sort of conduct will the ethics counsellor advise on? I mean, how could they assist in dealing with things like serious discrimination, for instance, like if there's, and talk to, I guess, MPs and senators about that? Like, what is the limitations of this role, or is there a limitation? Because what we are talking about in developing the code of conduct is also kind of preventing or calling out or stopping behavior like obviously sexual harassment, sexual abuse, but also discriminatory behavior, such as disability discrimination, racism, and other sorts of behavior. Does this ethics counselor play any role there?
Well, they will tend to have an educational role first, of course, and it's good to have them as part of the induction program and so forth. But the thing is that hopefully that sort of gives MPs an idea of what kinds of ethical issues they need to consider. So they actually do need, before going to the ethics counsellor, to realise that there might be an ethical issue, at which they then get advice as to what to do. If, of course, they either don't recognise an ethical issue, or ignore the advice, or lie to the ethics counsellor, in that case, that's not much. That's much good. In which case, that's where the IPSC steps in, because if the person hasn't recognised it's an ethical problem and doesn't follow the ethical advice, then they go ahead and they are discriminatory, or any of the hundreds of, maybe not hundreds, but the dozens of things that would breach the code. In that case, there's a complaint and it goes to the IPSC. But it doesn't go back to the ethics counsellor. The ethics counsellor is there to give advice, and if it's not taken, then the title of the essay I wrote in describing this is "Prior Advice is Better Than Subsequent Investigation." The ethics counsellor provides prior advice, and if that's not sought or taken, then the IPSC is likely to receive a complaint from somebody, and the wisdom of ignoring the ethical issue becomes questionable.
Mm-hmm. Just going back to training again, do any of you have any experience about what other parliaments do in the sense of training, which is much deeper than just the ethics, kind of sitting down with an ethics counsellor, like training like on gendered violence and harassment, or anti-racism training, or in Australia, something which is obviously very crucial is First Nations awareness training? Does that happen in other parliaments?
I could answer that. So I don't think they happen to quite the degree that I think perhaps you're thinking of. I think that from my experience, there will usually be, as part of an induction training, a broad discussion about ethics and codes of behaviour. Unfortunately, I also think that training will tend to focus on behaviour in the chamber, and less so than more general codes of ethics outside and interacting with staff, and more generally focused on things like discrimination, abuse, bullying. That doesn't happen quite as much and as rigorously as perhaps it should, but it certainly is something that is a parliament like Australia should focus on. I think that the problem with induction training also, and I just allude to the earlier question, is that it's very much information overload for members. As soon as they've started in their term of office, they have many other priorities, and there's a lot of things that administration want to cover, and that's not necessarily prioritising things like codes of behaviour and standards and ethics to the degree. They more want them up to speed on how to submit their expenses forms, or how to understand standing orders. So I think that that's certainly really important in any kind of holistic approach you take. And I think that providing proactively as well as reactively training on those sorts of topics that you mentioned, I think would be invaluable to help broaden out the scope of understanding. But one thing I also just want to emphasise is that I think that there's also an importance about training parliamentarian staff on the codes of conduct and codes of behaviour and the obligations of members, because oftentimes members will refer to them in their first instance for advice. How do I fill in this form? What do I do? And oftentimes, there's a turnover of staff. They'll forget. So I think it's important that a focus is also on member staff to provide that ongoing support. And likewise, political parties and those whips who are providing advice as well in a more informal setting for members, that they're on the same wavelength as what any ethics commissioner would expect to be covered. But in answer to your initial question, no, I don't think that there is sufficient training done on the sorts of topics that you need. And I think some of the members that gave evidence earlier in the week, particularly around gender discrimination, I think would emphasise that point, that is really needed to really have gender sensitised parliaments.
Thank you. And to ensure the efficacy of codes, do you think they should be regularly reviewed? I have seen other people talk about it as well. Do you think that's important? And in your experience, what's a good kind of period to review such codes when they're brought in?
I mean, I would say that they must be reviewed regularly. I think it was mentioned in a previous sitting that, we want the codes to be as perfect as possible, but that's never going to happen. I think that, political environments change so rapidly that an issue will occur that there'll be a gap in the codes that need to be addressed. So I think it needs to be done regularly, either every 2 to 5 years. But I think that if you're going to do a very broad kind of consultation process that's quite onerous for parliamentary administration and also tedious for members to constantly submit feedback on the codes. So perhaps every 5 years as a standard, and then a review when an issue crops up that the commissioner or the advisor says this really does need to be reviewed quite promptly by a committee. Then that can be done. Much like your standing orders, you can make ad hoc changes as you go along, but a more broader, holistic, whole kind of view of the codes done on a regular basis.
Yeah, and in your submission, I think you've talked about this idea of the Citizens' Assembly or equivalent non-partisan body, which can be convened to review the code and provide recommendations. So I'm really interested in that. Can you provide a bit more insight into such a system? Which parliaments that you know of have adopted it, and could something like that work for us in Australia?
Senator Furkey,
that's something that was put forward by the Accountability Roundtable in its submission, and it's really in the nature of an innovative suggestion rather than something which is known to work in practice. But it relies on a number of things. One is that there should be a review corresponding with the election of each parliament to make sure that there is a focus on the code of ethics by both the continuing and the new members of parliament, that as a result, rather than being utterly swamped by new information with information overload, they in fact would be forced by the very process to pay attention to what was in the codes and what the consequences of that might be for them as individuals. So it's very much of the nature of an innovative proposal, but it's one which we think is well worth considering, and we hope that the committee would give it serious consideration as one way of enculturating both continuing members and new members elected to either house.
Yeah, the idea of a participatory democracy and citizens' juries have worked well in other circumstances, not for codes, but other things. So, yeah, it's a very interesting idea. Thanks so much.
Senator
Thanks,
Furkey. I'm just going to ask Ms. Ryan for your question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for joining us and giving up your time to assist us in this process. It's quite intensive, as you can understand, and your years in the space are very useful. I have 3 questions. My first is, could someone step us through the relationship between the structures we're discussing and the privileges committees and how that operates? If you could step us through that.
Perhaps if I have a go at that one, we would see the Commissioner's report on where there's a finding of some breach of the code. It would either, if it was a criminal matter, would go to the appropriate authority, such as might be the police, it might be the National Anti-Corruption Commission, or it may be somebody like ACLI. And they would then deal with it as a criminal matter. And if that led to a conviction, well, there may be implications for the individual's membership of the Parliament, depending whether they'd breached the constitutional provision. So that's how we would see that side of it. If, however, it was a matter which was more a matter of ethical conduct rather than criminal activity, we would see that as being firstly a finding by the Commissioner that there was that the Commissioner believed that there had been a breach of the code in that non-criminal perspective, and it would then be referred to the Privileges Committee or the Privileges Committee to make a determination as to whether there had in fact been a breach of the code, and to recommend to the House the type of sanction which should be imposed, if any, and it may be very mild, as you will have seen from the list of sanctions which we have proposed. But that's the basic structure of it, that if it were a criminal matter, then it would be referred to the appropriate authorities. If it were an ethical matter which didn't appear to have criminal aspects to it, then it would go to the Privileges Committee. The Privileges Committee would then report to the House, and it would be a final decision of the House. Now, that's slightly different to the latest British model, but it's the model which we think could work.
Thank you, which takes me to the next question. We've had some evidence today and some conversation around the use of standing orders versus the use of legislation. So that relationship in terms of the Commissioner and privileges is built into standing orders. Is that how that has been structured? And what do any of you have a view around using standing orders versus legislation in these processes?
Well, Ken speaking again, and I suppose I'm influenced by my experience as a member of the Victorian Parliament and a student of how its ethics regime has developed. It has operated as a legislated code ever since 1976 or 78, whenever it was that the code was first introduced. And my observation is that aspect of the Victorian system has operated quite satisfactorily.
Thanks, Ken. I wasn't going to mention that I had the privilege of voting for you as a much younger person. It's Joanne, I member for Lawler, Ken.
Thank you.
Thank you for that response. And my last question goes to something very different, but the notion of the inductions have come up a couple of times already. My experience in being a parliamentarian and having come out of the education sector where we work in codes of conduct and value statements and those sorts of spaces, and I've been involved in developing a few, obviously, around staff and students. But my experience in parliamentary life is that we are very privileged to work with some of the brightest young minds in the country, and that is an absolute privilege to do. But we've had a lot of conversations or a lot of suggestions around the professionalisation of parliamentary officers, whether that be elected officers, ministerial officers, or our officers at Parliament. And it's an observation from me that we also hear a lot about the unique nature of the work we do and the unique workplace that it is. But one of my observations is that what we all desire are highly effective teams, and that this professionalisation piece is important in actually getting us to a place where people understand how to create and work within a highly effective team. Does anyone have any observations or comments around that in terms of the minimisation that could lead to improved behaviour and less requirement, if you like, for a code of conduct?
This is a great interest. I'm sure Ken's interested as well, but it's great interest to me. A lot of our current research is looking at professional governance, both the governance of professions and also the contribution of professions to the better governance of the institutions in which they operate. And it's interesting, of course, the Parliament will have people from lots of different professions. Interesting, some people sort of have argued in favour of actually only graduates could be MPs. I was in Kenya advising on their constitution, and I said I was absolutely shocked by that idea, that there shouldn't be such a barrier to MPs standing or being elected. But certainly the thing is that not just for professionalising them in the sense of forming their profession, but also pulling in from their professional knowledge, because often they'll come from a range of different professions, and for them to think about their role and the trust that's placed in them, just like trust is placed in other professions, to actually think in terms of those. But of course, the education of MPs, and of course you did mention staff and so forth, I think the thing is it suggests the opportunity for various learning experiences. And I think that it might be a very good idea for when it comes to parliamentary staff and so forth to receive some education, provided of course they've got the time to do it, and the time to really absorb it. But I think that the idea of professionalisation, not that every profession is like lawyers or doctors, but to learn sort of what the ideal of professionalisations could mean for the higher ethical conduct of public office holders is, I think, a very fruitful one, and the sort of thing that we're very interested in my institute.
It's Ken here again. If I can just add to Charles, and I certainly support what he has to say. I think one term which I haven't heard used in this inquiry is adult learning techniques. And I think that it's really important that in any programs for members of Parliament or their staff, it ought to use the now well accepted professional learning techniques rather than just a series of talking heads, which is more what I remember from my early days as a member of Parliament.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, adult learning and lifelong learning is a very important part of, and I think that universities are becoming much more open to a range of different ways of delivering. Some say delivering content, I would say delivering principles and understanding. One other thought that it's actually come in terms of institution, ways in which you put people together, parliamentarians together, to think about ethical issues. There are often parliamentary interest groups for, friendship with the Pacific Islands, in climate change, in the UN and so forth. It would be interesting to see that if there'd be a parliamentary interest group interested in forming about parliamentary ethics. Some cynics would say, well, of course they wouldn't have a parliamentary interest in ethics. I don't think that from the parliamentarians I know that that's a valid generalisation. So it might be parliamentarians think of how they can actually think about ethics, and a parliamentary interest group might be a start.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair. That exhausts my question.
Thanks, Ms. Ryan. Could I just pick up on I think you mentioned it was when you first mapped out the two main platforms of your evidence today, one being the Ethics Council and the second being the Independent Parliamentary Standards Commission. You said that an Ethics Council, albeit under a different name, was operating in Queensland. I'm just wondering if you could report to us on how long that's been in place, the sort of work that's being undertaken there, and how you are measuring success or otherwise.
It's interesting. It was introduced in 1999. I had the honour of leading a joint research project with the Public Service Commission on the Fitzgerald reforms 10 years on. And we came up with a number of recommendations, some of which were accepted, but one of the key ones was this idea of having an ethics commissioner and ethics counsellor, and then calling an integrity commissioner for doing the counsellor role. There was no question of sort of overlap as there had been in Canada. It was interesting because it was it had support on both sides of Parliament, and it had opposition on both sides of Parliament. And some of them I won't mention, even despite privilege, I won't mention names. One particularly senior Labor person, a member of Cabinet, was utterly opposed to the idea. One of the reasons is it's something that we'd actually quite publicly acknowledged, is that if you go to the Ethics Council or in our case the Integrity Commissioner to seek advice, ethical advice, they're not going to tell you, oh, if you do this, you'll just get away with it. They'll say this is the right thing to do, and that was and that was sort of trapping people into acting more ethically, because the thing is that if they wanted to get advice, then they have a get out of jail free key if they follow that advice, and they've got a letter to actually say that. But of course, if you want to act very close to the line, or very, then in that case, this is of no advantage as the problem. So that was an interesting thing that there was opposition, but the majority of his colleagues were actually committed to reform and took it on. And one of the interesting things is that the opposition, the Liberal National Party, it was the Liberals and the National Party, two separate parties, actually said, please can we have the advantage of this as well? And the Labor government said, no, this is ours, sort of thing, which is this is for government, which is actually, it sort of shows the confused nature, but also the fact that there was interest on both sides. And then 10 years later, I was involved in a review. Anna Bligh put together a team of 6 people to review the next 10 years, because you may recall that Queensland had gone through the embarrassment of having to, especially for the Labor Party, of having had 2 Labor ministers having to be sacked and going to jail. So we had a review of the integrity system in Queensland and had a number of changes. And one of the things was to open up the Integrity Commissioner to a lot more people, to not just the opposition, but also senior members of government boards and senior public servants and so forth. And this is actually, it tends to be used more and more. One of the ironies was, one of the problems was initially there were very few people who were seeking it. And we don't know why, but I think it was that they weren't familiar with it. They didn't, they were uncertain about what sort of advice they'd get if they were told to be too good. But in fact, the thing is that it has increased. More and more people have been taking it up. I don't have the numbers, but a recent Integrity Commissioner told me, it was in the hundreds of requests each year. And then, of course, they do sit down with I've forgotten exactly how often, they do sit down with ministers each year to go through some of the issues that they've got, and which I think is extremely useful. So it's come to be accepted as part of it. The most recent Integrity Commissioner was involved in some complicated conflicts, and which I don't know enough, and even if I do, I wouldn't say what my views are on those. But I think that it's been accepted as a legitimate body, and all the Integrity Commissioners have been seen to be independent. I don't think that any of them have been criticised for being political. And of course, they are subject to, as in Queensland, have got this approach of bipartisan support for any of the key commissioners. Integrity Commissioner, CCC, quite a few different Integrity Commission institutions actually have to have bipartisan support for election, which has some problems, but I think that's something we recommend for all integrity agencies, because it's really important that both parties can trust the person concerned to actually be confidential, but also to give them honest, independent advice, rather than, if you've got an ethical issue, you really want to go to somebody who you can absolutely trust. And if in fact there's somebody who can be trusted enough by both sides of politics to vote for them in the committee, because what happens is that there's an appointment process in which the successful appointee has to be nominated by the relevant parliamentary committee, and the majority must include a member of the government and a member of the opposition, and then that goes through to then there's the formal appointment, of course, which is a recommendation from the Premier to the Governor. But the core thing is that it has to have the appointee has to have the approval of both parties. So I think that it's pretty successful so far. All integrity institutions can be improved in all sorts of ways. Sometimes there are far too few resources in the past, but overall, I think that it's an important addition to the integrity infrastructure in Queensland, and it was a very good Canadian idea, which I've got to acknowledge.
Thank you. I'm just wondering,
Ken, if I can just add to that it's very much the Australian state model now that several of the other states have a similar position, and it's tended to be, not always, but it's tended to be retired clerks of the Parliament.
Okay. And just to clarify, that is not available to staff. It is only the Ethics Council was for the parliamentarians. And although I know you mentioned, Professor Sanford, it had recently, had opened up to some very senior kind of public servants, perhaps. Did I understand that correctly?
I can't give you I can't give you all the detail of it. It's certainly quite a public servants down to, I think, something like director level. So it's quite a few public servants. I don't know about the ministerial staffers. I suspect not. It's certainly, I don't remember it being raised. It may have been added, but I think that's actually a good idea.
Well, it's just that you raise the issue of sitting down and working through someone's shares portfolios, and I note that in Australia, in the Commonwealth Parliament anyway, ministerial staff also can't have shares in related portfolio areas. So anyway, that's fine. I was just interested to know how it was working in other jurisdictions, at least to begin with. Thank you for that. Sorry, Professor Cockhill, did you have anything further to add at that? I felt like I chopped you off inadvertently, sorry.
No, I was just making the point that it seems to be developing as the standard Australian model, at least amongst the state parliaments.
Yes, okay. Thank you. And I think I was just wondering, my question perhaps to Mr. Salek, you note I'm familiar with a lot of the work of the CPA, and in fact just returned from giving a paper in Halifax on some of these issues. But I note that the CPA submission, really, you provided the document around benchmarks, I think, recommended benchmarks for democratic legislators. But those benchmarks don't go to the issues of bullying and harassment specifically, which, is a very strong focus of the experience here that has generated a number of reviews, but culminating in the Sex Discrimination Commissioner's review, which is the one that's really guiding this inquiry in terms of our request to look at developing 3 separate codes of conduct. I'm just wondering if you do refer to the anti-harassment policy guidelines from the CPA. Where do you envisage the prohibitive statements on bullying, harassment and discrimination kind of falling in these areas? I mean, you're working across a lot of jurisdictions, but I'm interested where the CPA's had some thought. You've developed some benchmark guidelines, you've developed some anti-harassment policy work. How do you see these as coming together?
Well, I think that a lot of the materials that we have produced and codes of conduct more historically haven't necessarily focused on harassment and bullying. They have tended to focus more on corruption, financial transparency. And so there is, as you quite rightly mentioned, the benchmarks on the codes of conduct don't refer to those things, and they certainly should. And one of the things we'll be doing is looking at updating those and integrating harassment and bullying as part of that process. I think that it is really important. It's, I think, more of a more recent modern issue that has not been covered sufficiently and embedded as sufficiently as it should, particularly in more older codes of conduct by some jurisdictions who have very much, I would say, copied and pasted a sort of a Nolan principles, a very light touch approach. Whether you wanted to have a separate sets of codes that look at harassment and bullying, or integrate them all into a single one, I think is very much up to you as a jurisdiction and what you think is most appropriate. I think that it's just important that codes of conduct tend to be developed to fix an issue that has arisen, and there is sometimes a tendency to focus on that issue and to prioritize that issue, and not to look at it as broadly and as holistically as possible, and to look at every eventuality to make it as comprehensive as possible. So I think it's really important to make sure that you're future-proofing the codes to consider every eventuality as possible. And whether you want it to be, a broad code with a guideline attached to it, which simplifies things into an easier language. And like in the UK context, there's a kind of behavioural guidelines as well as a more comprehensive code. But I see that Catherine Stone is there, who can give much more information than I can on that context. But I think that's really important. But I would just say that if I could just end on one point, because I know that the Commissioner and advisors have been alluded to, I'd just say that one thing I think is really important is that the Commissioner or advisor is very much protected by the parliamentary institution and doesn't become a political football, as it tends to be in many jurisdictions. And it should be treated very much like an Auditor General will be treated by a Public Accounts Committee, in the sense that it's there to advise and support, but that the committee should be there, whether it's a Privileges Committee, Standards Committee, it should there to protect and look out for the interest of that person undertaking that work, because they're usually not a parliamentarian, they're a senior official, and they can be, at risk of not being able to defend themselves as robustly as others might be able to do, from, them being the person being attacked. Ironically, the person who's there to prevent bullying can sometimes be the victim of it. So I think I would just emphasise that point, if you do create a commissioner or advisor, that there is some protection put in place for them.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And you'll probably be... I'm sure the CWP will be pleased to note that we also had evidence here around some gender-sensitive parliaments and how the work that has been done there. So thank you for that. I know that we are extremely close to going across to our next witness, so I would like to just take this opportunity now to formally, sorry, there was one other question I did neglect to ask, and this was probably of Professor Cognell, actually. I note that you had some advice to us with regards to how some possible sanctions of parliamentarians that perhaps didn't undertake training or didn't conduct their affairs according to the Code of Conduct. Just wondering if you wanted to talk us through any of those in particular.
Well, it struck me that there should be some quite positive encouragement to members and senators to participate in professional development programs, which include ethical conduct, and that really needs to be seen as a normal, everyday part of being a member of Parliament, that you're expected to follow the principle that you're reflecting and responsible for the public interest. You're part of the trustees of the public trust, and part of fulfilling that responsibility is undertaking professional development, which is going to better equip you for those roles, the various responsibilities which you have as a member, as a backbencher, as a committee member, as a member of the executive. So that's how I would sum it up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That brings us to the conclusion of that discussion. Just a moment. I want to thank the three of you for your terrific evidence today. And if you have taken any questions on notice to, please provide that to the Secretariat by the 10th of October. And on that note, I'll say farewell to Mr. Salek, Professor Coghill and Professor Samford. Thank you. And although you're quite welcome to tune in and listen to our next witness, but I would like to now welcome our next witness for today's hearing via video conference, and that is Commissioner Catherine Stone, the United Kingdom's Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. And I welcome you to the hearing. For the Hansard record, I'd just appreciate it if you could please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today, and then I will invite you to make some opening comments after that. But we'll go with the formal introductions first.
Okay, thank you. And thank you very much for your kind invitation to be with you today. I'm honoured to be with you. I'm Catherine Stone. I'm the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards here in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Commissioner. And you are, as you've noted, joining us from the United Kingdom. And that means that I need to just remind you about how parliamentary privilege works at this end. So parliamentary privilege applies only to people giving evidence in Australia, and parliamentary privilege is a special right that means you cannot be prosecuted or disadvantaged because of anything you might provide in evidence that has been accepted by the committee or because you gave evidence. However, this privilege only applies within Australia, and a person outside of Australia is not protected by parliamentary privilege. So on that note, just that reminder, I want to invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of those remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions. So across to you, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It might be helpful for the committee if I were to briefly describe my role. As I said, I'm the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. I'm an independent officer of the House of Commons. The office was created in 1995 following the Cash for Questions scandal here. I'm the 6th Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. My tenure is a fixed term of 5 years, which is non-renewable and is due to end on the 31st of December of this year. As Commissioner, I'm responsible for the Register of Members' Financial Interests and for conducting independent, impartial, thorough and fair investigations into alleged breaches of the rules of conduct by Members of Parliament. My work is overseen by the Committee on Standards, who I also advise about issues relating to the Code. As Commissioner, I also consider allegations against Members of Parliament under the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme, the ICGS. And the ICGS process carries out independent investigations of complaints of bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct within the parliamentary community. My findings in these cases against Members of Parliament are referred to an independent expert panel which determines appeals and any sanction. And just to pick up on, if I may, some of the comments that were made by your earlier witnesses, I understand only too well the concept of the Commissioner becoming a political football. And almost a year ago, I was indeed a political football, and it became quite a challenging time for my team and for me. But I am confident that it was our reputation for independence, impartiality, thoroughness and fairness that helped us withstand those hostile challenges to our authority and to our decision making. Some of the other points that were made, Mr. Salek referred to bullying and harassment as recent things that are being investigated, and of course that's right. But in my view, bullying and harassment and sexual misconduct have always been wrong. We might only just be setting up processes and systems to investigate them and to promote better behaviour, but those negative behaviours, the humiliation, degradation, sexual misconduct, they have always been wrong in Parliament or anywhere else. And in terms of having principles, and one of the things you might go on to ask me later, is the difference between having aspirational principles, Nolan principles, or values upon which to base a code. Of course you must have those. And of course those principles and values are hugely important to set a culture or context. The challenge is, of course, that you also need some very clear rules to promote, because aspirational principles and values are not investigable. You know, if we look at the Nolan principles, take, for example, the concept of leadership, you can't investigate somebody not being a leader because we don't have rules about what being a leader means. But in terms of the bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct process here, we have very clear definitions of what bullying is, what harassment is, what sexual misconduct is, and they're all informed by other definitions used by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, by the Equalities Act. So those definitions will withstand scrutiny, and we apply those definitions to allegations of misconduct. So we have some very clear rules to rub up against and to investigate, rather than to say somebody's breached a value or a principle. I think I will leave it there for my opening remarks, and I'm very, very happy and delighted to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. I will go to committee members now, and Senator Maureen Faruqi.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, Commissioner Stones. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I think is it morning there for you?
It's just 9:09 in the morning, so a very civilised time to be meeting for me. I'm not sure about you, but thank you anyway.
No, thank you for being here. I might start off with a broad question about diversity. You know, in Australian parliaments, there is a real lack of diversity and representation of the community that lives in Australia. And a recent report that was done by Commissioner Jenkins on parliamentary culture did actually highlight that, and said that was really one of the big issues for us. The UK Parliament, as I know, is pretty diverse in many respects. So I'm just wondering if you could give us any ideas on why there is that difference and what we could do if there is any suggestions that you have to tackle this issue of diversity.
Okay. If I may, I'm going to stick to my sphere of experience and talk about how we promote diversity in our standard system. And you know, perhaps that might be a microcosm of a broader parliament. We have a diverse team in the Office of the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, and we are very proud of the diversity in our team. And we also, when we are investigating allegations made by members of the parliamentary community, ensure that the investigation is culturally appropriately investigated, so that if there are questions or factors around protected characteristics, we would ensure that the complainant has appropriate representation to ensure that they feel comfortable and confident in that space, and that any issues of protected characteristics being additional factors in the bullying and harassment, disability, sexuality, race, culture, faith, they are always considered as potential additional factors. It's part of a broader cultural piece, isn't it? And you know, when we talk about bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct, we are not talking about homogenous groups of people. We're talking about the ways in which different communities experience those things in different ways, and we really must be alive and sensitive to that. And I'm confident that within my team and our investigations, we are alive and confident about making sure that people are properly represented, have proper support mechanisms in place to manage any additional factors that there might be, and that our investigations are culturally and appropriately sensitive to those additional factors.
Thank you, Commissioner Stone. You mentioned, and it's in your submission as well, the independent expert panel. But I was reading somewhere else that there is also a lay member committee on standards in the
That's
UK
right.
Parliament. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could explain to me the difference between the two and what each does. I mean, you already did explain for the IEP, but what is the lay members committee on standards?
Okay, so the Code of Conduct is the code that's been in place since 1995. And that's the Code of Conduct that is the overarching code that considers members' behaviour in association with financial registration, paid lobbying, bringing the House into disrepute. The Bullying, Harassment and Sexual Misconduct Code, the Behaviour Code as it's called, was introduced in 2018, and there is a read across between the two codes. The Committee on Standards, which is the Select Committee, the Parliamentary Select Committee, has 7 members of Parliament and 7 lay members. And those lay members, in my view, are hugely important because they provide a check and challenge to the political focus of the members of Parliament on the Standards Committee. So on the Committee on the Select Committee on Standards has 7 members of Parliament. There are Conservative members, Labour members, Scottish National Party members, 7 in total. The 7 lay members have no political allegiance or affiliation and are not allowed to have had any political allegiance or affiliation. They are hugely knowledgeable, skilled and experienced individuals from a variety of backgrounds, including law, regulatory backgrounds, people who work in finance, people who've worked in health. We have the former police ombudsman from Northern Ireland. So some very, very senior people who come with a very rich body of knowledge, skill and experience. And they are very, very good at providing that critical friend perspective, as you would expect from a non-exec director to a board. They're the check and challenge to the Committee on Standards. They don't act as a homogenous group. They don't speak with one voice. There are a variety of voices and perspectives around the table. And there is also written into the standing orders the opportunity for those lay members to append a minority report to any report that's published by the Committee on Standards if they disagree with the outcome. So there might be a majority decision of the Committee on Standards, but if a member or members, lay members, disagree with that, they are able to append a minority report, and that will go to the floor of the House along with the report.
Yeah, just could you clarify for me, what is the role of the committee? Like, what do they actually do in terms of the code of behavior?
Okay, so I have to say, and I'll be candid with you, and I've said this in a public evidence session of the Committee on Standards, if you are looking to set up a process to look at conduct, you probably wouldn't start from where we are in Westminster, because at the moment we have the Code of Conduct, which set up in 1995, implemented by the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, overseen by the Committee on Standards with its 7 members of Parliament and its 7 lay members. Added into that in 2018 was the Behaviour Code, which is managed by an independent complaints and grievance scheme with an independent helpline, independent investigators, which after initial assessment comes back into my office for me to make a decision about whether or not to go forward with a full investigation under the bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct code. So there are two codes, if you like.
Yes.
Bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct cases, once I've made a decision, they go to an independent expert panel, not the Committee on Standards. The independent expert panel is chaired by the Right Honourable Sir Stephen Irwin, who is a retired High Court judge. The Deputy Chair is also a retired High Court judge, and there are barristers and former ombudsmen who make up the independent expert panel, and they scrutinise any report, any memoranda from my office to them, and any decision about sanction from my office about a Member of Parliament under the Independent Complaints and Grievance Scheme. So, as I said, there is a read across. So anyone failing to comply with a sanction imposed by the independent expert panel will automatically referred back to the Committee on Standards for a sanction from the Committee on Standards, which goes to the floor of the House. So it's not altogether straightforward, but it's a real progression. And most importantly, to go back to an earlier point, it has served to promote a cultural shift in the House of Commons that bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct are not acceptable and will be dealt with independently and may result in sanctions imposed by an independent expert panel, which the most severe sanction that they have is to expel a Member of Parliament. But the one that people are most fear, I think, is where the sanction is a suspension from the service of the House for a period of 10 days or more, which will now trigger the Recall Act of 2014, and there will be a petition for a by-election in the constituency of the Member of Parliament. So there is a very real risk of a Member of Parliament losing their seat if they are suspended from the service of the House for a period of 10 days or more following the imposition of a sanction, either from the independent expert panel or from the Committee on Standards.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Thank you for that. I mentioned this Jenkins review earlier, which is a review done of our parliamentary workplace culture. And that review noted that Parliament was considered by participants to be inherently unsafe, and especially for people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, people of color, people with disability, and LGBTQIA plus people. And I just want to come back to what you said as well earlier, which is the issue of intersectionality and the importance of recognizing and identifying that within a code of conduct, because these marginalized groups are always ignored. And I say that from experience as well. So I just wanted to get your view on the importance of identifying this sort of discrimination in the code.
I have to say, and I'll speak very personally, the idea that our democratic institutions should be seen as places which are unsafe, places to be feared, places that don't represent marginalized groups, is something that should profoundly sadden us all, actually. And the systems that we create to protect people must be representative of those people. You know, the saying, you can't be what you can't see. You know, we have to show people that their aspirations can be realized in a democratic institution, and they will be listened to, and they will be heard, and they will be protected. And we all know the statistics of people in marginalised groups who feel shut out, excluded, not listened to. You know, we have examples here of that sort of behaviour, and people being mistaken in courts for black barristers being mistaken for defendants in court. You know, a whole, that's just one recent example. It's a whole range of ridiculous things that in 2022 we should be ashamed of. So I would urge you to ensure that whatever system and process you have, you promote as strongly as you possibly can that this system is here for everyone, and no group, whatever their protected characteristic, whatever their lived experience, will be excluded from this. You will be able to use this system. It is for you. You will be listened to, you will be respected, and your complaints will be acted upon. And I can't stress that strongly enough. And we've tried very, very hard in the House of Commons to promote that. And of course, there will be people who still feel it's not for them. We have a lot of work to do because we have, in our case, hundreds of years of exclusion to overcome and to build trust and confidence. And what I have said to people who have told me that they doubt the integrity of the scheme, what I've said is, don't judge me on what I say, judge me on what I do, and judge me and judge this scheme on how it works for everyone.
We have, I guess, the benefit of so much experience from so many other places, and can really look to develop a code that leads the way because of that, I think. And Chair, if it's all right, just the last question from me.
Last question, please, and I'll move on to some others.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Commissioner, what role do reporting and review of codes do you think play in terms of judging its success or not?
Okay, so we have recently, the Committee on Standards and my office have together recently reviewed the Code of Conduct. And that's really important because the Code of Conduct was written in 1995. And of course, the world is a very, very different place now. We have social media, lots and lots of things happen in the social media space. Lots of meetings happen online. Things happen virtually, and we need to get ahead of, where those things are and how we can address them. So the Code of Conduct has been reviewed. The ambition is for the Code of Conduct to be reviewed once in every Parliament. And you probably be aware we've had quite a few parliaments in the past 5 years over here in Westminster. So we've managed in the past 5 years, we've managed one review of the Code of Conduct. That's now for the House of Commons to agree or to amend or whatever. But we had a very wide-ranging consultation. Members of the public, different institutions, different organisations wrote in with their perspective. And I'm confident that the Committee on Standards has reflected those different perspectives and concerns very, very well in the code that they have presented to the floor of the House.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Senator Faruqi. And if we've got time, I'm happy to come back. But I will. I have a few questions I'd also like to ask of you, Commissioner. And the first one is, in your written submission, you share a number of reflections based on your experience in developing and implementing those UK Parliament Behaviour Codes, which was then incorporated into the Code of Conduct for Members of Parliament. One of those reflections is that to, and I'm quoting here, to maximise its impact, any behavioural code needs to be drafted in simple terms and kept short. I just want to understand the significance of simplicity of as I recall it, it's a one-page document that the UK Parliament has. If you could step us through why you feel so strongly about that.
Okay. I am a passionate proponent of plain English. which is probably a contradiction in terms, actually. I feel very, very strongly that things need to be very easy to understand. In my view, you don't communicate when you write or speak, you communicate when you're understood. And if you have a very simple code, which is no more than a page with some very, very clear bullet points about what the expectations are, people can't say they didn't understand it. And that's something that is all over the House of Commons. It's in all the communal areas. It's in all the restrooms. It's in all the cafes. And sitting underneath that is a more detailed set of rules and things that, and a process and a policy that sit underneath it. But for example, just simply to say, bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct are wrong and will not be tolerated. That's a very, very clear, very, very simple statement. We also say that any breaches of the Code of Conduct will be investigated independently and may result in sanctions. That's a very, very clear statement. The counter to that is to have some training and some development materials, and every MP, every member of the parliamentary community is expected to attend a training session called Valuing Everyone, which goes through what bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct is and how people can manage their own behaviour or call out other people's behaviour. So actually the simplicity of the statement of the code is supported by a policy and a process that sits underneath it. It's also supported by a training and development and materials that support people, help people. There's an independent helpline that people can ring just for advice and guidance, just to check in with somebody about somebody's behaviour or how they're feeling about something, or advice and guidance about how to go about promoting a more inclusive workplace in their own office. So we have a number of different measures ranging from very simple statements to much more complex, sophisticated training materials that support the delivery of that very, very simple message that bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct are wrong in every context and will not be tolerated in the Houses of Parliament.
And in your experience, has that drafting of, that clear, really kind of principle-based statements succeeded in ensuring that everybody did feel that there was a genuine coverage of everybody in there? I mean, one of the things we're struggling with is, yes, there are differential experiences of discriminatory practices in the workplace. How do we ensure that our codes of conduct are indeed covering all instances of those behaviours that are either unlawful under any number of Australia's anti-discrimination pieces of legislation, or are, in terms of unethical or undesirable behaviours in amongst legislators. So I'm trying to tease out really how that code, that behaviour code, has been embedded into daily practice for people, and that there is a sense of ownership. How do you think you've done on that front?
Okay, well, the independent complaints and grievance scheme is separate from my office, and I'm happy to talk about some of the work that they've undertaken. For example, in ensuring that manual workers across the parliamentary estate who don't ordinarily have access to online materials or email updates, they've gone out and met with cleaning teams, security teams, maintenance teams, to talk to them about their rights, their responsibilities under this behaviour code. And they've made sure that the materials are available to them in ways that are not just based on an email pings into your inbox, or you have to go to a meeting at midday or in the afternoon. So they've worked very, very hard to promote that understanding and that inclusion across all the different teams that work in the House of Commons. Not everybody sits behind, Houses of Parliament. Not everybody sits behind a desk. Not everybody has access to a computer. Not everybody works in an office. And to go to Ms. Faruqi's point, it is so important that all these codes are accessible for everyone, whatever their role, whatever their background, whatever their access to the pieces of equipment that most people might have to enable them to make complaints or to read about what they might do. So there has been a lot of work to promote the cultural shift, not only with members of Parliament and parliamentary staff in offices, but also all the staff who are, in my view, the most important ones, who keep the wheels on and keep the place running in terms of the maintenance, cleaning the loos, serving the food, etc., etc.
Thank you. And I guess to ensure that the code is drafted in those simple terms and kept short, the plain English version that you kind of referred to, I mean, would you suggest that the code that we'd be looking at drafting our code in a principle-based fashion, so that, I'm looking at your code and I see, for example, that, you use sentences like respect and value everyone. Bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct are not tolerated. Then there's another, recognise your power, influence or authority and don't abuse them. So the code the code itself doesn't include those more detailed definitions about those terms or describing, detailed parts of behaviours. As I understood it, there's not an exhaustive list of discrimination or exclusion there, but that might perhaps be reflected in those underlying documents of policy that you referred to before that accompany this code. Is that how you have managed that tension between wanting to ensure that this is owned and experienced as belonging to everyone, this code of behaviour here, without ending up with a far larger than one-page document at the end of the day, I guess. So have I understood that correctly?
You have indeed, and this is my very well-thumbed copy of the policy and the process that sits under the one-pager, and there are other policies and processes that support that. But actually, the idea of setting those values, respect people, don't abuse your power and authority. People who hold elected office or people in senior leadership roles have to be very mindful of the impact of their power and authority on other people, and to use that power and authority wisely and well. And what our behaviour code is reminding people of is the importance of using your power and authority very wisely and use it lightly. When it comes to working with your colleagues, working with other people on the parliamentary estate. And it seems to me that it is incumbent on all of us to promote a respectful workplace and to promote a shared understanding of what we all expect from a workplace that is respectful, values everyone's experience, includes everyone's experience. This stuff is not about being a word that's bandied about quite a lot here at the moment is woke. This is not about being woke. This is about being respectful. It's about being inclusive. It's about understanding that people have multiple identities all at the same time. And any behaviour code or any code of conduct must be respectful of individuals and their lived experience and the experience that they bring. And therefore, having a one-page document that sets out very, very clearly what the expectations are, and it is aspirational, it is values-led, but the code that sits underneath that, the rules and the definitions, the policies and the processes that sit underneath that are detailed and include examples of things that people must do and things that they must not do. And it's, you know, sometimes it strikes me as really quite sad that we in 2022 should be having to say to people, please don't shout at your staff, please don't behave in completely unacceptable ways. And we do, and I would imagine that every workplace, if they were honest, had people who behaved inappropriately and needed to be challenged about that. I'm incredibly proud of the work that's been done in the Houses of Parliament to promote a cultural shift because of the understanding of the impact of bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct, not only on individuals, but on the wider community, and how, in my view, as I said earlier, the Houses of Parliament, the House of Commons where I work, should be the model of dignified, inclusive workplace practice. And the introduction of a code which sets out very clear expectations about what's acceptable and what's not in relation to bullying and harassment and sexual misconduct is a very, very important step along that road.
Thank you. I mean, it's been the tragic experience of both our parliaments, really, that a lot of this work and conversations has been born out of, you know, some horrific incidents and trauma, and really trying to make sure that none of that is has been for nothing. We're all trying to now ensure that this becomes a safe and respectful workplace, and that's the task. I think our Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, actually looked to the UK Parliament's behaviour code and said that it was a very useful example which to draw in the parliamentary context, given it's a simple, high-level statement that can be very easily publicly displayed. And I think I've understood really very clearly in your evidence today just the importance of having that kind of document that's appearing in, you know, the washroom, the computer terminal, the cafe. It sounds like it's extremely well populated throughout the Houses of Parliament. So, and that's been a significant part. Sorry, go on.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. That there can be no excuse. There can be no excuse for not knowing or understanding what the expectations are in respect of behaviour. And as you say, having that really wide presentation of the code, and in publications, online, going to meetings for people who don't have access to computer equipment, training sessions. It's about, it's not just about putting the posters up, it's about continuing the traction behind it, so that there is, so it becomes every day.
Yeah.
And it becomes something that people feel sufficiently confident to say, can I just stop you there? I just want to remind you of the behaviour code. Or, you know, we've had examples of members who've had copies of the behaviour code left on their desk, or, you know, some people who have walked past and pointed to something. And these are not only visual reminders, but they're also cues for people just to, okay, you know, is my behaviour okay? And it's a really, really good way of all of us checking that our behaviour is inclusive, appropriate, respectful, and how am I, and my team are absolutely brilliant. I am so privileged to work with a team of people who will check and challenge me every 5 minutes, let me tell you. But they challenge me and they challenge our team to make sure that we use our power and our authority very wisely and very well. You know, that the whole piece about quiet power, I think, is really, really important, and ensuring that, you know, to be in my role, you don't need to be dogmatic or loud or any of those things. You need to be, in my experience, you need to show humility, you need to show respect, you need to not only say you're going to be inclusive, but you need to show you're going to be inclusive. And you need to go out to where groups of people are and explain your role and how you can support. A lot of my work is about advising members of Parliament. And I spend a lot of time, my office is a safe space. Members of Parliament come and they ask confidential advice about situations that they might have got themselves into, or they might be asking for a friend. We spend a lot of time doing that. And it is a very, very important part of a cultural shift. And I can't commend this process highly enough to you as a way of giving people who are disadvantaged or feel marginalised or disempowered a real voice in a process, and that ensures that they now have an opportunity to say, you don't speak to me like that. You don't behave in that way to me. And actually, what you just suggested to me is completely inappropriate. So, you know, we have the aspirational values piece, we have the cultural shift piece, and we also have some very clear rules. And if you breach them, they will be investigated.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Ms. Ryan for a question in a minute. I just wondered whether you might be able to, if you haven't already, share with us the well-thumbed document of that has your underlying policies and principles. If that might be something we could share with the Secretariat to help guide us in some of our deliberations, that would be terrific. And also, I'm happy for you to take this on notice, but you had some good insights, you know, with the hindsight, with the privilege of hindsight, I guess, how you would have established the interface of all the different committees and your role now, you know, just saying it had grown in a slightly ad hoc fashion or responsive kind of manner, and that, you know, if you were to set your system again now, that it might look a little differently. So if you were in a position to share some of those insights about lessons learned and how you would structure things differently in 2022, I would be very grateful. And as I said, I'm very happy for you to take that on notice. I'm going to go to Joanne Ryan. I know there's lots of other questions. Senator Marine Farouk, he wants to come back in, so I'll cut my questions off to enable others to ask. So, Joanne Ryan, over to you first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for giving us your time. It's been fascinating listening. I come from an education background before joining Parliament 9 years ago, and have been involved in more than one school in terms of leading cultural change. Listening to you speak, what I'm hearing is attestation that there has been cultural change. How did you deal with, I mean, when we set out to change something, there are early adopters, but there are those who are fearful of change and who can become very resistant to change. It has been my experience that if you push people fearful of change too fast and too hard, they can become intransigent. How did you find that experience? I'm an early adopter. I know that most people on this on this committee are as well, and we all know where we want to get to. How did you map out how to get there rather than the aspirational where to get to.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We there is on the back of my written submission, there is a chronology and a timeline of the steps that were taken. You can imagine there were working groups and consultations and focus groups and House debates and so on. And this goes back to 2017. So this has been a kind of long time to get to where we are. And of course, before that, there would have been many, many years where bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct it did not go unnoticed, but went without any check and challenge to it, or there wasn't a proper framework for people to feel that they could raise those concerns. And your Jenkins review, I think, would be parallel to a review that was undertaken by Dame Laura Cox QC in 2017, who is herself a retired High Court judge and a kind of national expert on bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct. So her review gave the foundation lots and lots of different working groups and focus groups. The delivery report, which I'm sure my colleagues will, this is this document, and I'm sure my colleagues will ensure that this document is sent through to you for your consideration. That was published, it was approved by the House of Commons. And subsequent to that, we have got, we incorporated the independent complaints and grievance scheme process into the overarching code of conduct, so that any failure to follow a sanction from the independent expert panel would be a breach of the members' code of conduct. So we've had lots and lots of process points to get the change through. But to go to your point, Ms. Ryan, about how we promoted the cultural change, the House decided, the House agreed, and there were a lot of women members of Parliament and some male members of Parliament who felt that this was a priority, and they put their weight behind this and spoke eloquently, tirelessly, and incredibly passionately about the importance of a cultural shift. Now, what do we do about dinosaurs? What do we do about people who are intransigent about these changes? Ultimately, what happened to the dinosaurs? They died out. You know, this cultural shift, it is unstoppable, it seems to me, and it really cannot be something that we can allow people to get in the way of. We absolutely must promote dignity in the workplace, respectfulness in the workplace, appropriate ways of behaving in the workplace. And, you know, the most important place for me to demonstrate that commitment is, I think we refer to it here as the mother of all parliaments, the House of Commons. You might feel differently, but I think we're quite proud of it. So, you know, we have to all stand over and support this cultural shift. I try very, very hard to persuade those who are suspicious or cynical, but ultimately, if this is the will of the House, it's the will of the House, and it will be implemented.
Thank you. Music to my ears, obviously, but it's not really a but I'll be really interested to look at that, the history of from 2017 to now and the progression that was made, because from our perspective, you know, I think there are some who think there'll be a piece of paper created and that will solve all problems, and others who are determined quietly to ignore a piece of paper because they think that's what we're talking about, when in fact what we are talking about is stepping out the decade of work that this is going to take to get the kind of cultural shift that we need. And I welcome mostly the positively framed language around dignity and respect, and note with interest the sanction key that you mentioned earlier in terms of the trigger for a by-election with a 10-day suspension as sort of the big stick, but the positively framed language along the journey. And I imagine, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the uptake of that language took time and took a lot of energy from people who wanted to see the change the most.
It certainly did, and the sanctions. I mean, the most draconian sanctions are the trigger of the Recall Act of 2015 and the expulsion. But along the way, there are all sorts of other ways of resolving conflicts and issues between individuals, including informal resolution, mediation, written apologies, meetings where apologies are offered, training, coaching, mentoring, a whole range of different sanctions. Or lesser suspension, so for a day or for 2 days, which, you know, for a member of Parliament, I'm sure I don't have to tell you colleagues, is a hugely difficult and embarrassing sanction, as is actually standing up in the chamber of the House of Commons and apologising to the House for your conduct. It's, you know, these things are very real. The sanctions are very real, and they have very real bite. But the most important thing for me, Ms. Ryan, as you've just identified, is the positive framing of the language and the positive framing of the cultural shift towards a dignified, respectful and inclusive workplace.
Thank you, Commissioner. You've just, I suppose, deepened my understanding that all of the world is a classroom. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Ryan. Senator Faruqi, you had another question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I was listening with interest to your earlier conversation about the codes being simple and in plain English, and also having the positive language of dignified and inclusive workplaces. And I completely agree with that. But I do have a proposition for you. Some of the very few diverse people in Parliament have actually spoken to me and highlighted the issue of racism, of disability discrimination, of discrimination against LGBTQI people, and have basically said that bullying and harassment, often people don't even think about those things, those discriminatory practices, and that is true. And we have heard over the last few days also from witnesses who have said that the code should, if it's an intersectional code, should identify some of those behaviors. It may not be an exhaustive list, but even the exhaustive list is one sentence long, which our Human Rights Commission has on their website. So I guess my question to you is, why shouldn't we include those discriminatory behaviors, identify them over and above bullying, harassment, and sexual misconduct in a sentence, which won't make the code 5 pages long, but will have a huge impact on those people who face this discrimination in these workplaces and are afraid to even raise those issues because they are met with aggressive responses.
You're right. There should be that. And when we come to review the behaviour code, it's one of the things that we should include on that front very, very simple statement. It is included in the policies and the processes that sit under it.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right in your challenge that if we are to be fully inclusive, we should be making a very, very clear statement about that at each public point. So I absolutely understand your challenge and will go away and put that back into our process. Thank you very much for that. You're absolutely right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Stone, I'd really appreciate it if you'd share back with this committee how you think you would include that into your behavioural code of conduct, of standards of behaviour code, I'll get it right now, to ensure that there's, we're maintaining the simplicity, the plain English approach, but being inclusive and ensuring that there are that there is a clear sort of guidance around non-discriminatory behaviours.
Yeah,
that would be terrific.
I think it would be a very, very simple inclusion into the 6 or 7 point behaviour code.
Yep.
Which, the respect and value everyone, recognise your power, act professionally. It would be a very, very simple inclusion into that, because in the document that sits underneath it, there is reference to intersectionality,
Yes.
protected characteristics. Your challenge is quite right that we have it in the supporting documentation, and the clarity of the inclusive piece isn't on the front of it. So I'll take that away and make sure that we deal with that.
Thank you. And that's certainly one of the issues that sorry, Senator Faruqi, that's certainly, one of the points of debate and contemplation for this committee, is to ensure how that's, adequately included and where we need those detailed. That's why I'm interested in looking at those underlying documents as well. Thank you very much for that. Sorry, Senator Faruqi.
I was just about to say, sorry, Commissioner, would you recommend for us as well that we do include that on the front page, those discriminatory behaviours specifically?
I think so, because, we need to ensure that all our colleagues, whatever their background, whatever their lived experience, feel that this is a code for them.
Yeah.
That this is a code that they can use, that understands their lived experience, understands their experience of working in Parliament, and gives them a possibility of somebody understanding that experience if they've experienced bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner. I feel there is no reason to sacrifice marginalised people for, brevity.
Nobody would be getting sacrificed. I don't think this is a view of the committee at all, but I am interested in how we accommodate the I'll be very interested to see, Commissioner Stone, how you would address that in an additional or an amended sort of document at the front end, because that's really the sort of question, one of the questions I'm certainly sort of thinking through. We have very complex anti-discrimination laws in Australia, and if I went to the Australian Human Rights Commission for a definition of discrimination right now, it's an extremely long one and multiple, and it's so that would be a and it's based on age and all sorts of injury and caring responsibilities, and it's a very, very broad definition. So making sure that all of those experiences are indeed recognised, but we are able to ensure inclusivity, and we are unwittingly excluding people by some language that is going to be all-encompassing as well. So anyway, I'll leave you with that challenge. It's one of the challenges we're dealing with as well, but I know we have hit the magic time for you this morning in the UK, and I really do thank you enormously for both your time, but your experience and the knowledge and wisdom that you've been able to share with us all. I know that I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the committee members that it's been great to be able to have this interactive discussion with you this evening. So I thank you for your evidence today. And if you have taken questions on notice, which I know you have, it would be terrific if you are able to provide those responses through to the Secretariat by the 10th of October. So,
will do. Thank you so much, and I wish you every success with your endeavours. Thank you very much. Cheerio.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
And that concludes today's and this evening's hearings for those of us in Australia. Thank you to all the witnesses who appeared and to Hansard and Broadcasting who have assisted us throughout the day. And also, I know it's never in my notes here, but I'd like to thank the Secretariat that provide us with support. It's now 7 p.m. in Canberra, and I know that, we're very appreciative for the assistance. The committee has agreed that responses to questions taken on notice today should be provided by the 10th of October, and on that note, the committee now stands adjourned. Thank you, everyone.